Two ancient civilizations, thousands of years of history, countless wars, invasions, and rivalries that shaped the modern world. This is the complete story of the China-Japan conflict, from ancient times to the end of 2025. Buckle up, because this journey spans millennia. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into one of the most complex and fascinating rivalries in human history, the relationship between China and Japan. Now, before we get into the wars, the invasions, and the modern tensions, we need to understand where it all began. And trust me, this story goes back further than you might think. Let's rewind to ancient times, long before either nation had the borders we recognize today. China, with its ancient dynasties and sophisticated civilizations, was already a major power in East Asia. Japan, meanwhile, was still developing its own distinct culture on its island archipelago. The relationship between these two nations has always been complicated, a mixture of admiration, cultural exchange, rivalry, and outright conflict. The first contacts, learning from the giant. The earliest interactions between China and Japan weren't hostile at all. In fact, Japan looked to China with a sense of awe and respect. During the Han Dynasty in China, roughly from 206 BCE to 220 CE, Chinese culture, philosophy, and technology were incredibly advanced. Japan, which was still organized into various tribal societies, began receiving influences from the Chinese mainland through Korea. Think of it like this. Imagine you're living in a small village, and just across the water, there's this massive, glittering city with incredible architecture, advanced writing systems, and sophisticated government structures. You'd want to learn from them, right? That's exactly what early Japan did. By the 5th and 6th centuries CE, Japan was actively importing Chinese culture. Buddhism arrived in Japan around 538 CE, brought from China via Korea. This wasn't just a religion, it was an entire package of Chinese civilization, including art, architecture, literature, and political philosophy. Japanese emperors sent official missions to China during the Sui and Tang dynasties, and these envoys would return with books, Buddhist sutras, and knowledge about Chinese government administration. The Japanese even adopted the Chinese writing system, kanji characters, which they modified and combined with their own phonetic scripts. The Chinese capital of Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an, served as the model for Japan's own capital cities, first Nara and later Kyoto. The entire structure of the Japanese imperial court was based on Chinese models. The relationship dynamic. But here's where things get interesting. While Japan was learning from China, there was always an underlying tension. China, as the Middle Kingdom, viewed itself as the center of civilization. In the traditional Chinese worldview, the emperor was the son of heaven, and all other rulers were theoretically subordinate to him. This system, known as the tribute system, meant that neighboring countries would send gifts to the Chinese emperor, acknowledging his superiority, and in return, they'd receive recognition and trading privileges. Japan participated in this system, but never quite accepted the subordinate role that China expected. The Japanese emperors also claimed divine descent, from the sun goddess Amaterasu no less, and weren't about to genuinely acknowledge themselves as inferior to the Chinese emperor. It was like two people in a room, each believing they're the most important person there. In 607 CE, Japan sent a famous letter to the Sui dynasty that began, "The Emperor of the Land of the Rising Sun sends a letter to the Emperor of the Land of the Setting Sun." Notice the phrasing, rising sun versus setting sun. The Japanese were subtly suggesting they were ascending while China was in decline. The Chinese emperor was reportedly quite offended by this presumption. cultural exchange with an undercurrent. Throughout the 7th and 8th centuries, the relationship continued to be one of cultural borrowing mixed with political independence. Japan sent numerous missions to Tang Dynasty China between 630 and 894 CE. These weren't simple tourist trips. These were major diplomatic and educational expeditions, sometimes involving hundreds of people who would stay in China for years, studying everything from law to poetry to military tactics. But Japan was selective. They took what they wanted, the writing system, Buddhism, certain governmental structures, but adapted everything to fit their own culture and needs. Japan never adopted the Chinese civil service examination system, for example, because Japanese society was based on hereditary aristocracy, not meritocracy. By 894 CE, Japan officially stopped sending missions to China. Why? Several reasons. The Tang Dynasty was declining, the dangerous sea voyage wasn't worth the risk anymore, and perhaps most importantly, Japan felt it had learned enough. They now had the confidence to develop their own distinct civilization. It was like a student deciding they'd graduated and no longer needed their teacher. The seeds of future conflict. Even in these early centuries, we can see patterns that would repeat throughout history. China expected deference and acknowledgement of its supremacy. Japan admired Chinese civilization but refused to accept a subordinate position. China was the continental giant, vast and populous. Japan was the island nation, smaller but easier to defend. China thought in terms of a hierarchical world order. Japan thought in terms of independence and uniqueness. These different worldviews didn't cause open conflict in ancient times. The distance in Japan's island geography made direct confrontation unlikely, but they set the stage for everything that would follow. The relationship was never one of equals in Chinese eyes, and it was never one of genuine subordination in Japanese eyes. This fundamental disconnect would echo throughout the centuries. One more thing worth noting, throughout this period, Korea often served as the intermediary. Korean kingdoms were caught between these two powers, and much of Chinese culture reached Japan through the Korean peninsula. This triangular relationship, China, Korea, Japan, would become incredibly important in later conflicts. As we move forward in time, remember this foundational dynamic. Japan learned from China, respected Chinese civilization, but always maintained its independence and its own sense of superiority. China viewed Japan as a peripheral barbarian state that should show proper respect to the Middle Kingdom. Neither side was willing to see things from the other's perspective. In the coming centuries, as both nations grew more powerful and their interests expanded, this cultural and philosophical gulf would lead to something far more dangerous. But before we get to the wars and invasions, we need to understand what happened when both nations turned inward. All right, so we've established the early relationship between China and Japan. Cultural exchange mixed with political tension. But for several centuries, both nations were largely focused on their own internal affairs. China went through dynastic changes, and Japan developed its unique feudal system with samurai warriors and shogun military leaders. The two civilizations coexisted with minimal direct contact. That was about to change dramatically, and the catalyst for the first real military confrontation between the spheres of Chinese and Japanese power came from an unexpected source: the Mongols. The Mongol invasions of Japan, 1274 and 1281. Let's set the scene. It's the 13th century, and the Mongols, under Kublai Khan, grandson of the legendary Genghis Khan, have conquered most of the known world. They've swept across Asia, destroyed the Jin dynasty in northern China, and by 1271, Kublai Khan established the Yuan dynasty, claiming rule over all of China. These weren't just military victories. The Mongols had created the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Now, Kublai Khan wasn't satisfied with just controlling China. He wanted to expand Mongol dominance across all of East Asia, and that meant Japan needed to submit. In 1268, Kublai Khan sent an official letter to Japan demanding that the Japanese emperor acknowledge Mongol supremacy and pay tribute. The message was clear: submit peacefully, or we'll make you submit by force. The Japanese response? They essentially ignored the demands. The Kamakura shogunate, which was the real power in Japan at the time, viewed the Mongol threats as an insult. After all, Japan had never been successfully invaded in its history. They were protected by the sea, and they had their fierce samurai warriors. Why should they bow to these foreign conquerors? Kublai Khan didn't take rejection well. In 1274, he launched the first invasion. A fleet of about 900 ships carrying approximately 23,000 to 40,000 Mongol, Chinese, and Korean troops set sail for Japan. This was technically a Mongol invasion, but here's the important point. It was launched from conquered China, using Chinese resources, ships, and even soldiers who had been conscripted into Mongol service. This was the first time that forces based in China directly attacked Japan. The invasion force landed on the Japanese islands of Tsushima and Iki, quickly overwhelming the small local defenses. The Mongol army then moved to Hakata Bay in northern Kyushu, the main Japanese island. The Japanese samurai fought bravely, but they were facing tactics they'd never encountered before. The Mongols used gunpowder weapons, poisoned arrows, and coordinated group tactics, while the samurai were trained for individual combat and duels. It was like bringing a katana to a cannon fight. But then something remarkable happened. A massive storm hit the region, severely damaging the Mongol fleet. Fearing they'd be stranded without naval support, the Mongol commanders decided to retreat back to Korea. The invasion had failed, but not because the Japanese had defeated them in straight battle. Nature had intervened. Kublai Khan wasn't done. He spent the next several years planning a much larger invasion. He sent more diplomatic messages demanding Japanese submission, and when Japan again refused, he prepared for an overwhelming assault. In 1281, Kublai assembled one of the largest amphibious invasion forces in history up to that point. The numbers are disputed, but estimates suggest anywhere from 100,000 to 140,000 troops on over 4,000 ships. This fleet made the later Spanish Armada look modest. The invasion force was divided into two fleets, one from Korea and one from southern China. The plan was to converge on Japan and overwhelm the defenders with sheer numbers. The Japanese, meanwhile, had spent 7 years preparing. They built stone walls along the coast, fortified their positions, and trained specifically to defend against another Mongol assault. The invasion began in June 1281. The Mongols again landed on Tsushima and Iki, but this time, when they reached Kyushu, they found the Japanese much better prepared. The defensive walls prevented easy landing, and Japanese warriors conducted night raids on the Mongol ships using small, fast boats. The fighting was intense and went on for weeks, with neither side gaining a decisive advantage. Then, in mid-August, disaster struck the Mongol fleet again. Another massive typhoon, even stronger than the first, hit the area. The typhoon destroyed most of the Mongol fleet, sinking hundreds of ships and drowning tens of thousands of soldiers. The surviving Mongol forces had no choice but to retreat. The second invasion had failed even more catastrophically than the first. The divine wind. The Japanese called these storms kamikaze, which means divine wind. They believed that the gods themselves had intervened to protect Japan from foreign invasion. This event became deeply embedded in Japanese national consciousness, the idea that Japan was protected by divine forces and could never be conquered. This belief would resurface centuries later during World War II, when Japanese pilots volunteered for suicide missions, calling themselves kamikaze, hoping to replicate the divine intervention that had saved Japan from the Mongols. But from a Chinese perspective, though this was technically a Mongol invasion, it involved massive resources from China and showed that forces based on the Asian mainland could threaten Japan. It was the first major military confrontation between the continental power and the island nation. The Wako Pirates, Japanese raiders on Chinese coasts, 14th to 16th century. After the Mongol invasions, there was relative peace between China and Japan for several generations, but a new problem emerged: piracy. Starting in the 14th century and intensifying in the 15th and 16th centuries, raiders known as Wako, or Woku, began attacking coastal regions of China and Korea. Now here's where it gets complicated. Who exactly were the Wako? The Chinese and Koreans called them Japanese pirates, and many were indeed Japanese: ronin, masterless samurai, fishermen and merchants from southern Japan. But Wako groups also included Chinese pirates, Korean sailors, and various other nationalities. They were multinational criminal enterprises, kind of like the Pirates of the Caribbean, but in East Asian waters. These weren't just petty thieves stealing fish. The Wako raids were serious military operations. They would attack coastal towns and cities, sometimes penetrating far inland along rivers. They kidnapped people for ransom, looted goods, burned buildings, and disrupted trade. Some raids involved hundreds of ships and thousands of raiders. The Chinese Ming dynasty, which ruled from 1368 to 1644, spent enormous resources trying to defend against these attacks. The Chinese blamed Japan for the Wako problem. From their perspective, these were Japanese subjects raiding Chinese territory, and the Japanese government should control them. But Japan's central government was weak during this period. The country was fractured by civil war with various feudal lords fighting for power. The Japanese shogunate had limited ability to control what happened in distant provinces, let alone what Japanese sailors did in foreign waters. This created lasting resentment on both sides. China saw Japan as harboring and enabling pirates that attacked Chinese civilians. Japan felt unfairly blamed for a complex problem and resented Chinese attempts to dictate Japanese policy. The Wako problem would continue until the late 16th century, when stronger Japanese leadership finally cracked down on the pirates and China relaxed its maritime restrictions. The significance of the medieval period. So why does this medieval period matter? Because it established several important precedents. First, it showed that military conflict between forces based in China and Japan was possible and could be devastating. The Mongol invasions killed thousands and left psychological scars on both sides. Second, it showed the importance of naval power. Both the Mongol invasions and the Wako piracy were maritime affairs. Whoever controlled the seas between China and Japan held strategic advantage. This lesson would be remembered. Third, it created mutual distrust. The Chinese remembered Japanese pirates raiding their coasts. The Japanese remembered invasion attempts from the mainland. Neither side had much reason to trust the other. Fourth, it showed both nations' sense of superiority and separateness. The Japanese had successfully defended against the most powerful empire in the world, strengthening their belief in divine protection and military prowess. The Chinese continued to view Japan as a peripheral, semi-barbarous nation that refused to show proper respect to Chinese civilization. As we move into the late 16th century, both nations were about to undergo major transformations. The Chinese Ming dynasty, while still powerful, was beginning to show signs of weakness. Japan, meanwhile, was about to be unified under strong leadership for the first time in over a century. And when Japan was united, its ambitious leaders would look outward, towards the Asian mainland. What happened next would be one of the bloodiest and most devastating conflicts in East Asian history, and it would set the stage for centuries of enmity. We're about to witness Japan's first major attempt to conquer territory on the Asian mainland, and it's going to involve a full-scale invasion of Korea, with China stepping in to defend its tributary state. This is where things get really intense.
Here we go. This is where the China-Japan rivalry becomes a full-blown military conflict. We're in the late 16th century, and Japan has just been unified after more than 100 years of civil war. The man who accomplished this unification was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a brilliant military leader who rose from peasant origins to become the most powerful person in Japan. And after conquering all of Japan, Hideyoshi had an ambitious vision. He wanted to conquer China itself. Now, you might be thinking, wait, Japan tried to conquer China? How did I not know about this? Well, the invasions of Korea in the 1590s are actually well known in Korea and China, but they're often overlooked in Western history books. Yet these campaigns were massive, involving hundreds of thousands of troops, lasting 7 years and resulting in catastrophic casualties and destruction. This was East Asia's version of the 30 Years' War, and it would shape the region for centuries. Hideyoshi's grand ambition. After unifying Japan in 1590, Toyotomi Hideyoshi was at the peak of his power. He commanded the loyalty of hundreds of daimyo, feudal lords, and had an army of battle-hardened samurai who had spent decades fighting in Japan's civil wars. But now there was peace in Japan, and Hideyoshi needed to keep these warriors occupied and loyal. What better way than external conquest? His plan was audacious. He would invade Korea, use it as a bridge to invade China, conquer the Ming dynasty, and establish a new East Asian empire, with himself at its head. He even planned to move the Japanese imperial capital to Beijing. In his mind, this was Japan's destiny, to become the dominant power in Asia, replacing China's position. In 1590, Hideyoshi sent ambassadors to Korea, demanding free passage for Japanese armies to march through Korea to attack China. He expected the Koreans to simply agree, viewing them as a weak nation that should be grateful for Japanese attention. The Korean response was essentially, "Are you insane? We're not going to help you invade our ally and overlord." Korea had a tributary relationship with Ming China and was not about to betray them. Hideyoshi's reaction to this rejection? War. The First Invasion, 1592. In April 1592, a massive Japanese invasion force, approximately 158,000 troops on over 1,500 ships, crossed the Korea Strait and landed at Busan on the southeastern tip of Korea. The Japanese forces were divided into 9 divisions, each led by prominent daimyo, and they were equipped with advanced weaponry, particularly firearms. Japan had been importing and manufacturing matchlock muskets since the 1540s, and Japanese armies were among the most firearm-proficient forces in the world at that time. The initial Japanese advance was devastatingly successful. The Korean army, which hadn't fought a major war in centuries, was caught completely unprepared. Within just 3 weeks, the Japanese had captured Busan, Seoul, the Korean capital, and were advancing toward the northern borders. It seemed like Korea would fall entirely within months. The Korean royal court fled north, desperately sending appeals to Ming China for help. The Korean Navy, however, was having much more success than the army. Under the brilliant leadership of Admiral Yi Sun-sin, one of history's greatest naval commanders, Korean ships, including the famous turtle ships, heavily armored warships, began attacking Japanese supply lines and preventing Japanese naval dominance. Admiral Yi would become a legendary figure in Korean history for his victories against overwhelming odds. But the real game changer was China's decision to intervene. China enters the war. The Ming dynasty couldn't allow Japan to conquer Korea. First, Korea was a loyal tributary state. Abandoning them would damage China's prestige throughout Asia. Second, if Japan controlled Korea, they would share a border with China, putting Chinese territory at direct risk. The strategic calculus was clear: stop Japan in Korea or fight them on Chinese soil later. In July 1592, just 3 months after the invasion began, Ming China sent an initial force of about 5,000 troops to Korea. This first intervention was actually repulsed by the Japanese, but it showed that China was committed to the war. Over the next several months, China mobilized a much larger force. By early 1593, approximately 43,000 Chinese troops had entered Korea, and they launched a major counteroffensive alongside Korean forces. The combined Sino-Korean armies began pushing the Japanese back. The Japanese had conquered territory quickly, but holding it against determined resistance was another matter. Supply lines were stretched, Korean guerrilla fighters constantly harassed Japanese positions, and Admiral Yi's navy continued to intercept supply ships. The fighting was brutal. Cities and towns were burned, civilians massacred, and cultural treasures destroyed. The Japanese, frustrated by Korean resistance, committed numerous atrocities. One particularly horrifying practice: Japanese commanders, to prove their battlefield success to Hideyoshi, would cut off the noses and ears of their victims, both soldiers and civilians, pickle them in barrels, and ship them back to Japan. Tens of thousands of these body parts were collected in mounds that still exist in Japan today, grim reminders of the war's brutality. By April 1593, the Japanese had retreated to a defensive perimeter in southern Korea. Both sides were exhausted, and peace negotiations began. But here's the thing, Hideyoshi's demands were still absurd. He wanted Korea to become a Japanese vassal, wanted Chinese princesses sent to Japan for marriage alliances, wanted permission to trade with China, and even wanted the southern half of Korea permanently ceded to Japan. The Chinese, who had just pushed back the invasion, had no reason to accept these terms. The negotiations dragged on for 4 years, with neither side willing to compromise. And then, in 1597, Hideyoshi, frustrated by the diplomatic stalemate, launched a second invasion.
The Second Invasion, 1597 to 1598. The Second Invasion force was slightly smaller, about 141,000 troops, but no less determined. However, this time everyone was prepared. The Koreans had rebuilt and reorganized their defenses, the Chinese had troops already stationed in Korea, and even the Korean populace had mobilized for resistance. The war turned into a grinding, bloody stalemate. One of the most significant naval battles in history occurred during this phase, the Battle of Myeongyang in October 1597. Admiral Yi Sun-sin, who had been removed from command due to court politics but was reinstated after disasters at sea, led just 13 Korean ships against a Japanese fleet of over 133 ships. Through brilliant tactics, exploiting currents and narrow straits, Yi destroyed or damaged 31 Japanese ships without losing a single one of his own. It's considered one of the greatest naval victories in history, comparable to any of the famous battles of European naval warfare. On land, the fighting was less dramatic but equally deadly. The Chinese and Korean allied forces fought numerous engagements against the Japanese, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The war had settled into a pattern of sieges, skirmishes, and attrition. The entire Korean peninsula was devastated. Fields burned, cities destroyed, populations displaced or killed. Estimates suggest that between 500,000 and 1 million Koreans died during the 7 years of war, out of the total population of around 14 million. It was a demographic catastrophe for Korea. The war ends. Hideyoshi's death. In September 1598, Toyotomi Hideyoshi died of illness in Japan at the age of 62. With his death, the entire justification for the war vanished. The Japanese daimyo, who had never been enthusiastic about the costly Korean adventure, immediately began withdrawing their forces. The Council of Five Elders, who took control after Hideyoshi's death, ordered a complete evacuation of Korea. The final battles occurred in November and December 1598, as the Japanese conducted a fighting withdrawal. The Battle of Noryang, the last major naval engagement, saw Admiral Yi Sun-sin killed by a stray bullet just as the war was ending, a tragic ending for one of history's great naval commanders. By December 1598, all Japanese forces had left Korea, and the invasions were over. The aftermath and significance. So, what did this war accomplish? From a Japanese perspective, nothing. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers died, enormous resources were expended, and Japan gained no territory or concessions. The war is generally considered Hideyoshi's greatest failure, and one of the reasons his dynasty didn't survive long after his death. From a Chinese perspective, the Ming dynasty had successfully defended its tributary state and demonstrated its power, but the war was financially devastating. The military campaigns in Korea cost the Ming treasury enormous sums, weakening the dynasty's ability to deal with other problems, including the rising Manchu threat in the north. Some historians argue that the Korean campaigns contributed to the eventual fall of the Ming dynasty in 1644. From a Korean perspective, this was a national trauma. The country was devastated, Hundreds of thousands died, and countless cultural artifacts were destroyed or looted. The Japanese took Korean potters, scholars, and craftsmen back to Japan. These Korean potters, ironically, would establish some of Japan's most famous ceramic traditions. The war is remembered in Korea as the Imjin War, and it left a deep cultural scar and lasting resentment toward Japan. This was also the first major direct military confrontation between Chinese and Japanese forces. Unlike the Mongol invasions, which were technically Mongol operations using Chinese resources, this war saw the Chinese Ming army directly fighting the Japanese army. And it established several important precedents. First, it showed that neither side could easily defeat the other. The Japanese had superior firearms technology and battle-experienced troops, but China had greater numbers and resources. When China committed its full power, Japan couldn't win. Second, it demonstrated the strategic importance of Korea. The peninsula was the land bridge between China and Japan, and whoever controlled it had significant military advantages. Korea's fate would remain tied to Sino-Japanese relations for centuries. Third, it established a pattern of Japanese aggression and Chinese response. Japan was the revisionist power, seeking to expand and challenge the existing order. China was the status quo power, defending the traditional East Asian system. This dynamic would repeat. Fourth, it created lasting enmity. The Japanese remembered the war as a failed adventure, but also as proof that they could project military power onto the mainland. The Chinese remembered it as Japanese aggression that had to be repelled. The Koreans remembered it as a catastrophe brought on by Japanese ambition. After 1598, both China and Japan would turn inward for 2 centuries. China's Ming dynasty would fall in 1644, replaced by the Qing dynasty, which was founded by the Manchus from the north. Japan would enter the Tokugawa period, a long era of peace and isolation under the Tokugawa shogunate. The two nations would have minimal contact for 200 years, but the lessons of 1590s were not forgotten. The rivalry was dormant, not dead. And when both nations were forced to modernize and engage with the wider world in the 19th century, that ancient rivalry would reignite with even greater intensity.
After the devastating wars of the 1590s, both China and Japan entered periods of relative stability that would last for over 2 centuries. This might seem like a break in our conflict narrative, but understanding this period is crucial because it set up the conditions for the even more catastrophic conflicts to come. During these centuries, both nations developed in very different ways, and when they finally collided again in the late 19th century, the differences would be stark. Japan, the Tokugawa shogunate and Sakoku, 1603 to 1853. In Japan, the chaos following Hideyoshi's death was eventually resolved by Tokugawa Ieyasu, who established the Tokugawa shogunate in 1603. The Tokugawa family would rule Japan for the next 265 years, creating one of the longest periods of peace in Japanese history. But it was a very particular kind of peace, one based on rigid social control and almost complete isolation from the outside world. The Tokugawa shogunates established their capital in Edo, modern-day Tokyo, and created a system called Sankin Kotai, which required all daimyo to spend alternating years in Edo, effectively keeping them as semi-hostages to ensure loyalty. Japan was divided into strictly controlled domains. Social classes were frozen in place, and travel was restricted. It was a stable but stagnant society. But the most significant policy was Sakoku, the closed country policy. Starting in the 30s, the Tokugawa shogunate severely restricted foreign contact. Japanese citizens were forbidden from leaving the country, and foreigners were mostly expelled. Only limited trade was allowed, primarily with the Dutch and Chinese, and only through the single port of Nagasaki. Christianity, which had gained followers in the previous century, was violently suppressed. Why did Japan close itself off? Several reasons. The shogunate feared that Western colonial powers might invade, they worried that Christianity would undermine Japanese social order, and they wanted to prevent daimyo from gaining wealth and weapons through foreign trade that might challenge shogunal authority. For over 200 years, Japan was essentially cut off from global developments. While Europe went through the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution, Japan remained technologically and militarily stagnant. The samurai still carried swords, there was no modern industry, and military tactics hadn't changed since the 1600s. However, it wasn't all stagnation. Japanese culture flourished in these centuries. The arts, literature, theater, and crafts reached high levels of sophistication. The merchant class grew wealthy, literacy rates were relatively high, and cities like Edo became among the largest in the world. But Japan remained militarily weak compared to the modernizing Western powers, and Japanese leaders had no idea just how far behind they had fallen. China. The Qing dynasty's rise and peak, 1644 to 1800s. In China, the end of the Ming dynasty was weakened by the Korean campaigns, internal rebellions, and fiscal problems finally collapsed in 1644. In its place arose the Qing dynasty, founded by the Manchus, a people from Manchuria in Northeast Asia. The Manchu conquest was itself a significant military campaign, but by 1683, the Qing had consolidated control over all of China, including Taiwan. The early Qing emperors, particularly Kangxi, ruled 1661 to 1722, Yongzheng ruled 1722 to 1735, and Qianlong ruled 1735 to 1796, were capable rulers who expanded China's territory to its greatest extent. The Qing Empire incorporated Mongolia, Tibet, Xinjiang, and reaffirmed control over tributary states including Korea, Vietnam, and Burma. At its peak in the 18th century, Qing China was arguably the wealthiest and most powerful nation on Earth. Its population grew from about 150 million in 1600 to over 400 million by 1850. Chinese porcelain, silk, and tea were luxury goods sought across the world. The capital, Beijing, was magnificent, and the imperial court was opulent beyond measure. But there were problems beneath the surface. The Qing dynasty maintained the traditional Chinese worldview, the Middle Kingdom concept, where China was the center of civilization and all other nations were barbarians who should pay tribute and acknowledge Chinese superiority. This worldview was increasingly out of sync with reality, particularly as European powers grew stronger and more aggressive. China's military was also becoming outdated. While the Qing armies had been effective in the 17th and 18th centuries for conquering internal territories and fighting other traditional Asian armies, they weren't keeping pace with European military innovations. The banner system, the Qing's hereditary military force, was becoming corrupt and ineffective. There was no modernization of weapons, tactics, or organization comparable to what was happening in Europe. Moreover, China's governing philosophy emphasized Confucian scholarship over practical, technical, or military knowledge. The civil service exam system, which had many virtues, selected officials based on their knowledge of classical texts, not their ability to deal with modern challenges. When Western powers began demanding trading rights and diplomatic recognition, Chinese officials were often baffled and dismissive, not understanding that they were dealing with equals or even superiors in military technology. Minimal contact between China and Japan. During these 2 centuries, China and Japan had very little direct contact. Japan's closed country policy meant no official relations, and China was focused on its internal affairs and managing its vast borders. The 2 nations existed in parallel, each convinced of its own superiority, each following its own path. Chinese officials, when they thought about Japan at all, still viewed it as a peripheral, semi-civilized nation that had correctly borrowed Chinese culture centuries ago but remained inferior. Japanese intellectuals, despite their isolation, maintained some knowledge of China through the limited Chinese books that reached Nagasaki, but they increasingly developed a sense of Japanese uniqueness and superiority, particularly regarding their emperor, who claimed unbroken descent from the sun goddess. Both nations were essentially living in a bubble, unprepared for the storm that was approaching from the west.
The Western powers arrive. The 19th century brought dramatic changes to East Asia, and these changes would force both China and Japan out of their isolation and into direct conflict with each other. The catalyst was the aggressive expansion of Western imperial powers, particularly Britain, France, Russia, and the United States. For China, the wake-up call came with the First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, against Britain. British merchants, frustrated by trade restrictions and seeking to balance their purchases of Chinese tea and silk, had been illegally smuggling opium into China from British India. When Chinese authorities cracked down on the opium trade, Britain responded with military force. The war was a humiliating disaster for China. British steam-powered warships and modern artillery devastated Chinese coastal defenses. The Qing military, which had seemed so impressive against traditional Asian opponents, was completely outmatched by European technology. In 1842, China was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking, the first of what the Chinese call the unequal treaties. Under this treaty, China had to cede Hong Kong to Britain, open 5 ports to British trade, grant extraterritorial rights to British citizens, meaning British people in China were subject to British, not Chinese, law, and pay a massive indemnity. It was a shocking loss of sovereignty for the Middle Kingdom, and it marked the beginning of what the Chinese call the Century of Humiliation. More disasters followed. The Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860, against Britain and France, resulted in even more concessions, including the burning of the Old Summer Palace in Beijing, a cultural catastrophe. Internal rebellions, particularly the Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864, which may have killed 20 to 30 million people, further weakened the Qing dynasty. China was in crisis, its traditional order collapsing, its military impotent against Western powers, and its government scrambling for solutions. Japan was watching all of this with growing alarm. Perry's Black Ships and the Meiji Restoration. In July 1853, American Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Edo Bay with 4 warships, the famous Black Ships, and demanded that Japan open itself to trade. Perry's ships were steam-powered and heavily armed, and his message was clear: open your ports, or we'll force them open. The arrival of Perry's fleet threw the Tokugawa shogunate into crisis. They could see what had happened to China: defeated, humiliated, forced to sign unequal treaties. The shogunate, knowing they couldn't resist American military power, agreed to open Japan to trade. In 1854, the Convention of Kanagawa was signed, followed by more comprehensive treaties in subsequent years. But this capitulation to foreign demands fatally weakened the Tokugawa shogunate. Many Japanese, particularly the samurai class, were outraged that Japan had submitted to barbarian demands. A movement arose around the slogan "Sonno Joi," meaning "revere the emperor, expel the barbarians." These activists wanted to restore power to the Japanese emperor, who had been a figurehead under the shogunate, and to resist Western encroachment. After years of political turmoil and brief civil war, the anti-shogunate forces won. In 1868,
the Tokugawa shogunate was overthrown and Emperor Meiji was restored to actual power in what's called the Meiji Restoration. But here's the crucial part. The new Meiji government quickly realized that expelling the barbarians was impossible. Western military technology was too advanced. Instead, Japan would have to modernize rapidly to avoid China's fate. The Meiji government launched an extraordinary program of modernization. They sent missions abroad to study Western government, education, military systems, and industry. They abolished the feudal system, created a modern centralized state, established compulsory education, and built railways and telegraph systems. Most importantly, they created a modern military based on European models, with conscription, modern weapons, and up-to-date tactics. Within just 2 decades, Japan transformed from a feudal, isolated nation to a modern industrial power with a strong military. It was one of the rapid and most successful modernization programs in history. And as Japan grew stronger, Japanese leaders began to look outward with new ambitions. The stage is set. By the 1870s and 1880s, both China and Japan were dealing with the challenge of Western imperialism, but in very different ways. China was struggling, weakened by rebellions, defeats, and an inability to modernize effectively. The Qing government launched various reform efforts, including the self-strengthening movement, which attempted to modernize the military and industry while preserving Confucian values. But these reforms were half-hearted and hampered by corruption and conservative resistance. Japan, in contrast, was modernizing rapidly and successfully. More importantly, Japanese leaders were learning the lessons of international power politics. They observed that in the age of imperialism, strong nations conquered weak ones. Western powers had carved up much of Asia and Africa into colonies. Japan's leaders concluded that to avoid being colonized, Japan must become a colonizer itself. And where would Japan expand? The answer was obvious: Korea and Manchuria, the same territories that had been contested in the 1590s. But now, China, Japan's ancient rival, stood in their way. China still considered Korea a tributary state under its protection, and Manchuria was Qing territory, the ancestral homeland of the ruling dynasty. For centuries, China had been the dominant power in East Asia, and Japan had either admired it from afar or challenged it unsuccessfully. But now, for the first time, Japan felt it could compete with China on equal or even superior terms. The ancient cultural rivalry was about to become a modern military conflict. The confrontation was inevitable. Both nations claimed spheres of influence in Korea. Both were competing for regional dominance. And the international environment, where imperialism was the norm and military strength determined status, encouraged conflict rather than cooperation. The stage was set for the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 1895, a conflict that would shock the world, humiliate China, establish Japan as a rising power, and set in motion events that would lead to some of the bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century. The long peace was over, and the modern era of Sino-Japanese conflict was about to begin. And trust me, what happens next will reshape East Asian history in ways that are still felt today.
We've now reached one of the most pivotal moments in East Asian history, the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895. This conflict would fundamentally reshape the balance of power in the region and shock the entire world. For thousands of years, China had been the dominant civilization in East Asia, the Middle Kingdom that all others looked up to. Japan had always been seen as the smaller, peripheral nation.
But in less than a year of warfare, that ancient order would be completely overturned. This war matters because it wasn't just about territory or influence. It was about which vision of modernity would prevail in Asia. Would it be China's slow, reluctant adaptation while trying to preserve traditional values? Or Japan's rapid, wholesale embrace of Western-style modernization? The answer would have consequences that echo down to our present day. The powder keg, Korea. As we discussed, Korea was the flashpoint. For centuries, Korea had been a tributary state of China, acknowledging Chinese superiority and receiving protection in return. But after Japan's Meiji Restoration, Japanese leaders increasingly saw Korea as essential to their security and economic interests. There was even a phrase in Japanese strategic thinking: Korea was a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan. If a hostile power controlled Korea, Japan would be vulnerable. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, both China and Japan increased their involvement in Korean affairs. Japan forced Korea to sign the Treaty of Ganghwa in 1876, opening Korean ports to Japanese trade and formally declaring Korea independent, which was a direct challenge to China's claim of suzerainty over Korea. China responded by increasing its own presence in Korea, sending advisors and troops. Korea itself was divided between modernizers who looked to Japan, traditionalists who looked to China, and nationalists who wanted to chart an independent course. The Korean king, Gojong, was caught in the middle, trying to play the powers against each other while maintaining Korean independence. It was an impossible situation. In 1882, there was a military revolt in Korea, and China sent troops to restore order. In 1884, pro-Japanese reformers attempted a coup, and again Chinese forces intervened. Each incident brought China and Japan closer to war, but both sides backed down. In 1885, they even signed the Convention of Tianjin, agreeing that neither would send troops to Korea without notifying the other first. But this was a temporary patch on a fundamental problem. Both nations wanted to dominate Korea, and neither was willing to accept the other's supremacy there. The Tonghak Rebellion, the spark. The immediate cause of the war came in 1894 with the Tonghak Rebellion, a peasant uprising in Korea, driven by both economic grievances and religious nationalism. The Tonghak movement was a syncretic Korean religion that mixed Confucian, Buddhist, and Taoist ideas with opposition to foreign influence. When the rebellion broke out in southern Korea, the Korean government, unable to suppress it, requested Chinese military assistance. China agreed and sent troops, notifying Japan as required by the 1855 convention. But Japan responded by also sending troops, claiming they were needed to protect Japanese citizens and interests in Korea. By June 1894, both Chinese and Japanese forces were in Korea, ostensibly to suppress the rebellion, but really they were there to confront each other. The Koreans, realizing the danger, quickly suppressed the rebellion themselves and asked both China and Japan to withdraw their forces. China agreed. Japan refused. Japanese forces in Korea, acting on orders from Tokyo, seized the Korean royal palace in Seoul in July 1894, effectively making the Korean government a Japanese puppet. They then demanded that Korea abolish its tributary relationship with China and expel Chinese advisors. When Korea, under duress, agreed, Japan had manufactured a justification for war. They claimed they were defending Korean independence against Chinese interference. On July 25, 1894, without a formal declaration of war, Japanese warships attacked Chinese naval vessels off the Korean coast. On the same day, Japanese forces engaged Chinese troops on land. The First Sino-Japanese War had begun. The military campaign. Japan's dominance. What happened next shocked everyone, including the Japanese themselves. The war was supposed to be a contest between China, a vast empire with 4 times the Japanese population and centuries of military tradition, and Japan, a small island nation that had only modernized in the past 25 years. Most foreign observers expected China to win, or at least to fight Japan to a costly stalemate. Instead, Japan won decisive victories on land and sea, demonstrating a level of military effectiveness that stunned the world. Let's start with the naval war. In September 1894, the Japanese and Chinese fleets met at the Battle of the Yalu River. Not to be confused with the river of the same name in the Crucian War, this was a naval battle fought where the Yalu River meets the Yellow Sea. The Chinese Beiyang fleet was actually quite impressive on paper, with modern ironclad warships purchased from European manufacturers. But the Japanese combined fleet under Admiral Ito Sukeyuki had better training, better coordination, and superior tactics. The battle lasted about 5 hours. The Japanese fleet used superior speed and maneuverability to concentrate fire on Chinese ships one at a time, while maintaining better formation and fire discipline. By the end of the engagement, the Chinese fleet had lost 5 ships and retreated back to its base in Weihaiwei. The Japanese had won command of the sea, which meant they could supply their armies in Korea and threaten the Chinese coast, while China could not reinforce or supply its forces effectively. This naval victory was crucial because it exposed one of China's fundamental weaknesses. They had purchased modern weapons, but hadn't truly modernized their military system. Chinese ships had impressive guns, but their crews were poorly trained, their officers were often appointed through political connections rather than competence, and corruption meant that ammunition and supplies were often substandard or embezzled. One famous incident reported that Chinese ships ran out of shells during battle because officers had sold much of the ammunition and filled the storage areas with sand to hide the theft. On land, the story was similar. Japanese forces using modern tactics and well-coordinated operations rapidly advanced through Korea and into Manchuria. In September 1894, Japanese armies crossed the Yalu River into Chinese territory. The Chinese forces, despite having numerical superiority in many engagements, were consistently defeated. Japanese infantry, trained in modern European tactics, would use coordinated fire and maneuver. Chinese forces often fought bravely, but were hampered by poor leadership, outdated tactics, and a lack of coordination between different units. One battle after another ended in Japanese victory. The Battle of Juliancheng, the Battle of Lushenkou, Port Arthur, the Battle of Weihaiwei. Each victory expanded Japanese territorial gains and further demoralized Chinese forces. The capture of Port Arthur in November 1894 was particularly significant and particularly brutal. After taking the fortress, Japanese soldiers, angered by fierce Chinese resistance, massacred thousands of Chinese soldiers and civilians in what became known as the Port Arthur Massacre. This atrocity, widely reported in the international press, shocked Western observers and gave Japan its first serious image problem as an emerging power. By February 1895, Japanese forces had also captured the Weihaiwei naval base, destroying the remainder of the Beiyang fleet. China's most modern military forces had been defeated, and Japan controlled the seas and much of southern Manchuria and the Liaodong Peninsula. Chinese forces were in retreat, and there was nothing to stop Japanese armies from advancing towards Beijing itself if the war continued.
Why did Japan win? The Japanese victory was so complete that it demands explanation. How did a nation that had been feudal and isolated just 27 years earlier so thoroughly defeat an empire that had existed for thousands of years? First, Japan had truly modernized its military. The Meiji government had sent officers to study in Europe, hired foreign advisors, and built a military based on the best practices of Prussian and British models. Japanese soldiers were conscripts who received thorough training, and officers were selected based on merit and education at military academies. The entire system emphasized discipline, coordination, and modern tactics. China, in contrast, had only partially modernized. The self-strengthening movement had purchased modern weapons and even built some modern arsenals, but it hadn't reformed the military system itself. Officers were still often appointed through personal connections or purchased their positions. There was no unified command structure. Different regional armies operated independently, and rivalries between commanders hampered cooperation. Training was inadequate, and traditional ideas about warfare persisted alongside modern weapons. Second, Japan had a unified national purpose. The Meiji Restoration had created a strong central government with clear goals. The entire nation was mobilized for the war effort, and there was broad public support.
China, in contrast, was riven by internal divisions. The Qing dynasty was ruled by the Empress Dowager Cixi, who was more concerned with maintaining her power and traditional privileges than with effective military reform. Regional officials often prioritized their own interests over national needs. Corruption was endemic, sapping resources and morale. Third, Japan had the strategic advantage of fighting close to its home bases with secure sea lines of communication, while China had to fight far from its centers of power with vulnerable supply lines. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, Japan had fully internalized the lessons of modern warfare, while China had not. Japanese leaders understood that war in the industrial age required total national mobilization, modern logistics, and centralized command. Chinese leaders still fought in terms of traditional warfare and failed to adapt to new realities. The Treaty of Shimonoseki, Japan's gains. By March 1895, the Qing government knew the war was lost and sued for peace. Negotiations took place in the Japanese city of Shimonoseki, and China sent Li Hongzhang, one of its most capable officials and a key figure in the self-strengthening movement, to negotiate. But China had no leverage. Japan had won completely and could dictate terms. The Treaty of Shimonoseki, signed on April 17, 1895, was devastating for China. First, China had to recognize Korea as fully independent, ending centuries of Chinese suzerainty over the peninsula. In practice, this meant Korea was now in Japan's sphere of influence. Second, China had to cede territory to Japan, the Liaodong Peninsula in southern Manchuria, Taiwan, and the Pescadores Islands. These weren't peripheral territories. Taiwan was a significant island, and the Liaodong Peninsula included the strategic Port Arthur naval base. Third, China had to pay a massive indemnity of 200 million taels of silver, about 7,500 tons of silver, roughly equivalent to 3 years of Japanese government revenue. This was an enormous sum that would cripple Chinese finances for years. Fourth, China had to open more treaty ports to Japanese trade and grant Japanese citizens the right to establish factories and businesses in China. Economic concessions that gave Japan significant commercial advantages. Fifth, China had to grant Japan most favored nation status, meaning any concessions China gave to other countries would automatically apply to Japan as well. It was a humiliating peace, and it marked China's decisive defeat in the ancient rivalry. For the first time in history, China had been comprehensively beaten by Japan. The psychological and political impact was enormous. The Triple Intervention. Russia, Germany, and France step in. But the story doesn't end with the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Just 6 days after the treaty was signed, something unexpected happened. Russia, Germany, and France jointly intervened, demanding that Japan return the Liaodong Peninsula to China. This became known as the Triple Intervention. Why did these European powers care about Japanese territorial gains? Russia was expanding its influence in Manchuria and wanted to build a railway across the region. The Liaodong Peninsula, with its strategic Port Arthur harbor, would give Russia access to a warm water port on the Pacific. If Japan controlled this territory, Russian ambitions would be blocked. Germany and France joined Russia, partly because they had their own interests in China, and partly because they didn't want to see Japan become too powerful. The three powers couched their intervention in diplomatic language, claiming they were acting for peace in stability, but the message was clear. Give back the Liaodong Peninsula or face a war with 3 major European powers. Japan was furious, but had no choice. Having just fought an exhausting war with China, Japan couldn't possibly fight Russia, Germany, and France simultaneously. On May 5, 1895, Japan reluctantly agreed to return the Liaodong Peninsula to China in exchange for an additional indemnity of 30 million taels of silver.
This triple intervention had several important consequences. First,
It taught Japanese leaders that despite their military modernization, they were still not strong enough to resist the great European powers. This would drive even more intensive military buildup in the coming years. Second, it created deep resentment in Japan toward Russia in particular, sowing the seeds for future conflict. Third, it exposed China's weakness even more. China hadn't been able to defend the Liaodong Peninsula, but European powers had simply taken it back through diplomatic pressure, making it clear that China was now an object, not a subject, in international affairs. The final insult came in 1898, when Russia forced China to lease the very same Liaodong Peninsula, including Port Arthur, to Russia for 25 years. Japan had been forced to give it back to China, only to watch Russia take it 3 years later. The sense of injustice in Japan was intense and would not be forgotten. The aftermath: reshaping East Asia. The First Sino-Japanese War fundamentally reshaped East Asian politics and psychology. Let's consider the impact on each major player. For China, the defeat was a catastrophic blow. The Qing dynasty had been defeated by its ancient rival, a nation China had always considered inferior. The massive indemnity payments drained the treasury, making further modernization even more difficult. The war exposed Chinese military weakness to the world, encouraging other imperial powers to demand concessions and carve China into spheres of influence. The scramble for concessions in the late 1990s saw Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and Japan all demanding and receiving territorial leases, mining rights, railway concessions, and other privileges. China seemed on the verge of being completely partitioned like Africa had been. The defeat also triggered an intellectual crisis in China. If modernizing weapons alone wasn't enough to defeat Japan, what would China need to change? Some reformers argued for political reform, constitutional government, and wholesale cultural transformation. The 100 Days Reform of 1898 was an attempt at rapid political and institutional change, but it was crushed by conservative forces led by the Empress Dowager Cixi. The failure of reform would contribute to the Boxer Rebellion of 1800, an anti-foreign uprising that would bring even more disaster to China. For Japan, the victory was transformative. In less than 30 years since the Meiji Restoration, Japan had proven it was not just a modern nation, but a major military power. The international prestige was enormous. Japan was now taken seriously by Western powers as an emerging force. The territorial gains, particularly Taiwan, gave Japan its first formal colony, marking the beginning of Japanese imperialism. The indemnity payments funded further industrialization and military expansion. But the victory also fed a dangerous sense of confidence and entitlement. Japanese leaders had proven that military force could achieve national objectives, that Japan could compete with and defeat larger powers, and that expansion was both possible and profitable. These lessons would drive increasingly aggressive policies in the coming decades. For Korea, the war was a disaster. Nominally independent after the treaty, Korea was actually under Japanese domination. Over the next decade, Japan would steadily increase its control over Korean affairs, culminating in formal annexation in 1910. The Korean people who had hoped for genuine independence found themselves under Japanese colonial rule instead. For the international system, the war demonstrated that the age of European dominance might not be permanent. A non-Western nation had defeated a massive Asian empire using Western military methods. This was noted not just in Asia, but around the world. Colonial subjects in India, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere took notice.
modernization and resistance were possible. The myth of inevitable Western superiority was beginning to crack, setting up the next conflict. The First Sino-Japanese War resolved none of the underlying tensions between China and Japan. If anything, it intensified them. Japan had won, but its gains were limited by European intervention, particularly Russian interference. Japanese leaders, rather than being satisfied, were now more determined than ever to secure Japan's position in Northeast Asia, which meant eventually confronting Russia for control of Manchuria and Korea. China, humiliated and weakened, was determined to resist further losses but lacked the power to do so. Chinese nationalists would spend the next several decades trying to modernize their country and restore its dignity. The defeat by Japan became a central element in Chinese national consciousness, a symbol of humiliation that must be avenged. Korea remained caught between the powers, its independence a fiction, its fate tied to the larger struggle for regional dominance. And in the background, the great powers, Russia, Britain, France, Germany, and now Japan, were all competing for influence in China and Northeast Asia, creating a volatile mix of rival ambitions. The First Sino-Japanese War was not the end of the conflict between China and Japan. It was merely the opening act of a tragedy that would play out over the next 50 years, reaching levels of brutality and destruction that would shock the world. The rivalry had entered a new phase, one that would lead to even larger wars, atrocities, and ultimately to the Second World War in Asia. But before we get to those even darker chapters, we need to understand what happened next: Japan's war with Russia, China's collapse into chaos, and the development of modern nationalism in both countries that would make their next confrontation even more bitter and total.
The victory over China transformed Japan's international position, but it also created new problems. As we saw, the Triple Intervention forced Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula, with Russia being the main instigator of this diplomatic pressure. Then, just 3 years later, Russia turned around and leased that very same territory from China, including the crucial warm water port of Port Arthur. From a Japanese perspective, this was outrageous hypocrisy. Russia had prevented Japan from keeping territory only to take it for themselves. But this was about more than just one peninsula. Russia and Japan had fundamentally conflicting interests in Northeast Asia. Russia was expanding eastward, building the Trans-Siberian Railway and establishing itself as the dominant power in Manchuria. Japan viewed Manchuria and Korea as its natural sphere of influence and essential to its security and economic development. One way or another, these two rising powers were going to collide. The road to war with Russia. After the war with China, Japan continued to strengthen its military, particularly its navy. The indemnity paid by China funded a major naval expansion program. Japanese leaders studied the Triple Intervention carefully and concluded that they needed to be strong enough that no power could dictate terms to them again. They also recognized that to secure their interests on the Asian mainland, they would eventually need to fight Russia. But Japan also understood it needed international support. In 1902, Japan signed the Anglo-Japanese alliance with Great Britain, the most powerful nation in the world at that time. This was a stunning diplomatic achievement, an Asian nation signing a military alliance with a European great power as an equal partner. The alliance meant that if Japan went to war with Russia and another power joined Russia, Britain would enter the war on Japan's side. This effectively neutralized the possibility of another triple intervention. Russia, meanwhile, was extending its influence in Manchuria. Russian troops had entered Manchuria during the Boxer Rebellion of 1900, ostensibly to protect Russian interests, but they hadn't left afterward.
Russia was building railways, establishing settlements, and treating Manchuria as effectively its own territory. Russia also had interests in Korea, and there were growing tensions over which power would dominate the Korean peninsula. Japan proposed a compromise. Russia could have Manchuria if Japan could have Korea. Russia refused, viewing both regions as within its sphere of influence. Negotiations throughout 1903 went nowhere. Russian officials, influenced by racism and underestimation of Asian military capabilities, didn't take Japanese concerns seriously. They assumed that if war came, the Russian military, representing a great European empire, would easily defeat an Asian upstart. This was a massive miscalculation. The Russo-Japanese War, David versus Goliath. On February 8, 1904, without a formal declaration of war, a tactic that would become a Japanese pattern, the Japanese Navy launched a surprise torpedo attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. 2 days later, Japan formally declared war on Russia. The Russo-Japanese War had begun, and the world was watching. This was the first major war between a European great power and an Asian nation since Mongol times. Most Western observers expected Russia to win. The war had two main theaters, the land campaign in Manchuria and the naval campaign for control of the seas. The naval war was dominated by one of the most decisive battles in maritime history, the Battle of Tsushima in May 1905. After the Japanese fleet blockaded Port Arthur and destroyed most of Russia's Pacific Squadron, the Tsar sent the Baltic Fleet, the pride of the Russian Navy, on an 8-month journey around the world to relieve Port Arthur and defeat the Japanese Navy. It was an epic voyage. The Baltic Fleet sailed from the Baltic Sea around Africa. Since the Suez Canal was controlled by Britain, Japan's ally, and was closed to them, across the Indian Ocean, and finally approached Japan through the Tsushima Strait between Korea and Japan. The fleet was exhausted, its ships' hulls fouled from months at sea, its crews tired and demoralized. The Japanese combined fleet, under the brilliant Admiral Togo Heihachiro, was waiting. On May 27-28, 1905, in the Battle of Tsushima, the Japanese fleet comprehensively destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet. Of the 38 Russian ships that entered the battle, 21 were sunk, 7 were captured, and 6 were disarmed in neutral ports. Only a handful escaped. The Japanese lost 3 torpedo boats. It was one of the most one-sided naval victories in history, comparable to Trafalgar or Salamis. Admiral Togo became a national hero and was studied in naval academies around the world. The battle demonstrated Japanese naval excellence and effectively ended Russia's ability to challenge Japan at sea. The land war in Manchuria was harder fought, but told a similar story. Japanese armies under commanders like General Owayan Iwan and Marshal Yamagata Aritomo consistently defeated larger Russian forces. The Battle of Mukden in February-March 1905 was one of the largest battles in history up to that point, involving over 600,000 soldiers combined. After 3 weeks of fighting, Japanese forces captured the city, inflicting heavy casualties on the Russians. However, the land campaign was costly for Japan. Unlike the naval war, the fighting on land was grinding and brutal. Japanese casualties mounted, and the economic strain of the war was becoming severe. Japan was a much smaller and poorer country than Russia, and financing a major war was stretching its resources to the limit. By mid-1905, Japan desperately needed the war to end, even though it was winning. Russia, meanwhile, was facing internal crisis. The war was deeply unpopular, defeats had humiliated the regime, and revolutionary movements were gaining strength. In January 1905, Bloody Sunday in St. Petersburg saw troops fire on peaceful protesters, sparking the 1905 Russian Revolution. The Tsar's government was tottering, and Russia needed to end the war. The Treaty of Portsmouth. Japan joins the great powers. Both sides needed peace, but neither wanted to appear to be begging for it. Enter Theodore Roosevelt, the American president, who offered to mediate.
Peace negotiations took place in Portsmouth, New Hampshire in August 1905. The Japanese delegation was led by Foreign Minister Kimura Jutaro, the Russian by Sergei Witte. The resulting Treaty of Portsmouth, signed on September 5, 1905, represented a Japanese victory, though not as complete as Japan had hoped. Russia recognized Japan's paramount interest in Korea, effectively giving Japan a free hand there. Russia ceded to Japan the southern half of Sakhalin Island, the Liaodong Peninsula, including Port Arthur, and Russian railway rights in southern Manchuria. Russia also had interests in Manchuria and allow it to return to Chinese control, although in practice, Japan would now have significant influence there. However, Japan did not receive the large financial indemnity it had demanded. This caused anger in Japan, where the public and press felt that the enormous sacrifices of the war should have resulted in greater gains. There were riots in Tokyo protesting the treaty. The Japanese government had to declare martial law to suppress the protests. Still, strategically, Japan had achieved its goals. Korea was now firmly in the Japanese sphere, and Japan had replaced Russia as the dominant power in southern Manchuria. Most significantly, Japan had defeated a European great power in war, something no Asian nation had done in modern times. The victory sent shockwaves around the world. For colonized peoples across Asia and Africa, Japanese victory was inspiring. It proved that Western powers were not invincible, that Asian nations could modernize and compete. In India, China, Vietnam, and elsewhere, nationalists and reformers took note. The age of unquestioned Western dominance might be ending. For Western powers, the Japanese victory was alarming, particularly the completeness of the naval victory at Tsushima. Naval strategists studied the battle intensely. The war also shifted the balance of power in Asia. Japan was now recognized as a major power, the dominant force in Northeast Asia, and a potential threat to Western interests in the region. For Russia, the defeat was catastrophic. It contributed to the 1905 revolution and the eventual collapse of the Tsarist regime in 1917. Russia's position in East Asia was permanently weakened, and its ambitions in Manchuria and Korea were finished. Theodore Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize for mediating the Treaty of Portsmouth, but his role also marked the beginning of tensions between the United States and Japan. American leaders were becoming concerned about Japanese expansion and began to see Japan as a potential threat to American interests in the Philippines and China.
The annexation of Korea. With Russia out of the way, Japan moved to consolidate control over Korea. In 1905, Japan forced Korea to accept a protectorate status through the Ulsa Treaty. Korea's foreign relations were placed under Japanese control, and a Japanese resident general was appointed to oversee Korean affairs. King Gujong of Korea desperately tried to resist, even sending secret delegations to international conferences to plead for help. But no power was willing to challenge Japan on this issue. Korean resistance was fierce. There were numerous protests, uprisings, and even assassinations. In 1909, An Young-gun, a Korean nationalist, assassinated Ito Hirobumi, the former Japanese prime minister who was serving as resident general of Korea, at a train station in Manchuria. An Young-gun became a Korean national hero, and his act demonstrated the depth of Korean resistance to Japanese rule. But resistance was futile. On August 22, 1910, Japan formally annexed Korea, making it a Japanese colony. The annexation treaty was signed under duress by the Korean government, and Korea ceased to exist as an independent nation. It would remain under Japanese colonial rule for the next 35 years. Japanese colonial rule in Korea was harsh. The Japanese authorities suppressed Korean culture, forced Koreans to adopt Japanese names, made Shinto shrine worship mandatory, and exploited Korean resources for Japanese benefit. Korean language and history education were restricted. Thousands of Koreans were forced into labor. including sexual slavery in the form of comfort women during later wars. The colonial period left scars on the Korean psyche that persist to this day and remain a major source of tension in Japan-Korea relations. From a Japanese perspective, the annexation was a strategic necessity and a civilizing mission. Japan portrayed itself as modernizing backward Korea. But from the Korean perspective, this was naked imperialism, the destruction of their ancient nation, and brutal exploitation. China watches. The Revolution of 1911. What was China doing during all of this? China was collapsing. The humiliating defeat by Japan in 1895 had triggered a series of crises. The scramble for concessions by foreign powers continued. The Boxer Rebellion of 2000, a violent anti-foreign uprising supported initially by conservative elements of the Qing government, ended in disaster when an 8-nation alliance, including Japan, invaded China, captured Beijing, and forced China to pay yet another massive indemnity. Chinese intellectuals and reformers were in despair. The Qing dynasty seemed incapable of defending China or modernizing effectively. Some reformers advocated for a constitutional monarchy along Japanese lines. Others argued that the entire imperial system was the problem and that China needed a republic. Young Chinese students studying abroad, particularly in Japan, were exposed to modern political ideas: nationalism, republicanism, democracy. Many became revolutionaries, dedicated to overthrowing the Qing dynasty. The most prominent was Sun Yat-sen, who founded the Revolutionary Alliance, Tongmunghui, in Tokyo in 1905, bringing together various revolutionary groups. The Qing government did attempt reforms. After 1901, they launched the New Policies Reform Program, modernizing education, creating new armies, and even preparing for constitutional government. But it was too little, too late. The dynasty had lost legitimacy, and revolutionary sentiment was spreading. In October 1911, a military uprising in Wuhan triggered a series of provincial secessions. Province after province declared independence from the Qing dynasty. The revolution spread rapidly, and by February 1912, the last Qing emperor, Puyi, who was only 6 years old, abdicated. The Republic of China was proclaimed, with Sun Yat-sen as its provisional president. The fall of the Qing dynasty ended over 2,000 years of imperial rule in China. It was a momentous change, but it didn't bring stability. China descended into decades of chaos, warlordism, and civil war. The new republic was weak, and actual power was held by regional military leaders who fought each other for control. China's weakness continued to benefit Japan. While China was tearing itself apart, Japan was growing stronger, more industrialized, more militarized, and more ambitious. The gap between the two ancient rivals was widening. Japan's 21 demands, testing the limits. World War I broke out in Europe in 1914, and Japan saw an opportunity. Japan was allied with Britain and declared war on Germany, quickly seizing German colonial possessions in China, the Shandong province, and German islands in the Pacific. European powers were focused on the war in Europe and couldn't pay attention to Asia. Japan had a free hand. In January 1915, Japan presented 21 demands to the Chinese government. These demands were breathtaking in scope. They included confirming Japanese control over former German possessions in Shandong, extending Japanese leases and economic rights in Manchuria and Mongolia, a joint Chinese-Japanese control of China's largest iron and coal company, a pledge that China would not cede coastal territory to any other power, and most outrageously, Japanese advisors in the Chinese government, police, and military. If fully implemented, these demands would have reduced China to a Japanese protectorate. China appealed to Western powers for help, but Britain and the United States, needing Japanese cooperation during World War I, offered only limited support. Under intense Japanese pressure, including an ultimatum backed by military threats, China accepted most of the demands in May 1915, though the most extreme provisions were temporarily shelved. The 21 demands caused outrage in China. National Humiliation Day was established to commemorate China's capitulation. Anti-Japanese sentiment intensified. Chinese students and intellectuals began organizing boycotts of Japanese goods. The May 4th movement of 1919, a watershed moment in modern Chinese history, was triggered partly by anger over the Versailles Treaty's decision to transfer German rights in Shandong to Japan, rather than returning them to China. Chinese nationalism was hardening, and at its core was resistance to Japanese imperialism. Japan had replaced Western powers as the primary threat to Chinese sovereignty in Chinese national consciousness.
The Washington System and temporary restraint. After World War I, there was a brief period where it seemed like international cooperation might limit Japanese expansion. The Washington Naval Conference of 1921 to 1922 established treaties limiting naval armaments and pledging to respect China's territorial integrity. Japan agreed to return Shandong to Chinese control and accepted limits on its naval forces. Throughout the 1920s, Japan experienced a period of relative liberalism and democracy known as Taisho democracy. Political parties gained power, universal male suffrage was enacted, and militarism seemed to be in decline. Japan cooperated with the international order, respected treaty commitments, and moderated its policies toward China. But this was a surface calm. Underneath, forces were building that would lead to catastrophe. In Japan, the military maintained significant independence from civilian government and resented treaty limitations. Economic problems in the 1920s, including a major earthquake in 1923 and financial crises, created discontent. Nationalists and militarist groups argued that Japan needed to expand to secure resources and markets. The idea of an Asian Monroe Doctrine, that Japan had a special right to dominate East Asia, just as the United States dominated the Western Hemisphere, gained popularity. In China, the chaos was slowly resolving. The Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, or KMT, led by Chiang Kai-shek after Sun Yat-sen's death in 1925, launched the Northern Expedition to reunify China. By 1928, China was nominally unified under KMT rule, though warlords still controlled some regions. The Chinese Communist Party, founded in 1921, was growing despite KMT suppression. Chinese nationalism was intensifying, and resistance to Japanese imperialism was a unifying cause. The stage was set for the next and most devastating phase of the Sino-Japanese conflict. The Mukden Incident, the point of no return. On September 18, 1931, an explosion occurred on the South Manchurian Railway near Mukden, now Shenyang. The railway was owned and operated by Japan, and Japanese officers of the Kwantung Army, the Japanese military force stationed in Manchuria to protect Japanese interests, claimed that Chinese dissidents had sabotaged the line. This was a lie. Japanese officers had staged the explosion themselves as a pretext for military action. Without authorization from the civilian government in Tokyo, the Kwantung Army immediately launched a full-scale invasion of Manchuria, claiming they were responding to Chinese aggression. The Mukden incident marked a turning point. The Japanese military, operating independently and even defying civilian government orders, had initiated a war of conquest. And rather than punish the officers responsible,
the Japanese government ultimately supported them. The lure of Manchuria, vast territory rich in resources, was too strong to resist, and nationalist sentiment in Japan supported the expansion. By early 1932, Japan controlled all of Manchuria. In March 1932, Japan established a puppet state called Manchukuo, nominally ruled by Puyi, the last Qing emperor, whom Japan had installed as a figurehead. In reality, Manchukuo was a Japanese colony in all but name, its resources exploited for Japanese benefit, its administration controlled by Japanese officials. The international response was weak. The League of Nations condemned Japanese aggression and sent the Lytton Commission to investigate. When the Commission's report criticized Japan, Japan simply withdrew from the League of Nations in March 1933. There were no meaningful sanctions, no military intervention. The Western powers, dealing with the Great Depression and still scarred by World War I, were unwilling to confront Japan militarily. China appealed desperately for international help, but received only sympathy. Chinese forces, under orders from Chiang Kai-shek not to resist, he was focused on fighting the communists in central China and believed China was too weak to fight Japan, retreated. Nationalist sentiment in China was furious at this non-resistance policy, but militarily, there was little China could do. The Mukden incident and the conquest of Manchuria began Japan's 15-year war in Asia that would eventually merge into World War II. The Japanese military had tasted victory, seized valuable territory, and faced no serious consequences. The lesson was clear: aggressive expansion worked. But this expansion would not stop in Manchuria. Japan's appetite grew, and its next target would be China itself, not just a province, but the whole country. And when that invasion came, it would unleash horrors that would shock the world and create wounds between China and Japan that remain unhealed to this day.
We've now reached the most devastating conflict in the history of China-Japan relations, the Second Sino-Japanese War, which lasted from 1937 to 1945 and would eventually merge into World War II. This war would kill between 15 and 20 million Chinese people, mostly civilians. It would involve some of the worst atrocities in modern history. It would devastate China's economy and infrastructure. And it would create a level of enmity between China and Japan that persists to this day. This is going to be difficult material to cover because we need to confront the brutal reality of what happened. War crimes were committed on a massive scale. The suffering was immense. But we need to understand this history because it fundamentally shaped modern East Asia and because the memory of this war continues to affect China-Japan relations in 2025. Let's begin. From Manchuria to war, the escalating crisis, 1931 to 1937. After seizing Manchuria in 1931-1932, Japan didn't stop. Japanese forces gradually expanded their control south of the Great Wall into northern China proper. There were constant incidents, skirmishes, and provocations. Japan established a demilitarized zone in northern China and sponsored separatist regimes to split off northern provinces from Chinese government control. China, under Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government, was in a difficult position. Chiang's priority was fighting the Chinese Communist Party, which he saw as an existential threat to his rule. His strategy was internal pacification before external resistance. Defeat the communists first, then deal with Japan. This policy was deeply unpopular. Chinese public opinion demanded resistance to Japanese aggression, but Chiang believed China needed more time to prepare and unify before it could effectively fight Japan. The communists, led by Mao Zedong, were in a desperate situation. After failed uprisings in cities, they had retreated to rural areas and established Soviets,
revolutionary base areas. In 1934, facing annihilation by nationalist forces, the Communists embarked on the Long March, a year-long retreat covering thousands of miles that became legendary in Communist mythology, though thousands died during the journey. By 1936, the surviving Communists had established a new base in Yan'an in northwestern China. Everything changed with the Xi'an incident in December 1936. Zhang Shuiliang, a nationalist general whose father had been killed by the Japanese and who was frustrated by Chiang's non-resistance policy, kidnapped Chiang Kai-shek in the city of Xi'an. Zhang, influenced by communist agents and his own patriotism, demanded that Chiang stop fighting the communists and instead form a united front against Japan. After tense negotiations, mediated by Zhou Enlai, representing the communists, Chiang was released in exchange for agreeing to a ceasefire with the communists and committing to resistance against Japan. The Second United Front, an uneasy alliance that would not last beyond the war, but for now, China was united in purpose. The Marco Polo Bridge Incident. War begins. On the night of July 7, 1937, Japanese and Chinese troops exchanged fire at the Marco Polo Bridge, Lugochao, near Beijing. The exact circumstances remain disputed, who fired first, whether it was accidental or deliberate. But unlike previous incidents, this time the conflict didn't stop. Fighting escalated, and by the end of July, Japanese forces had occupied Beijing-Tianjin area. Japanese military leaders saw an opportunity to solve the China problem once and for all through a short, sharp campaign that would force China to accept Japanese dominance. They underestimated Chinese determination to resist and the difficulties of conquering such a vast country. The Japanese offensive expanded rapidly. Japanese forces attacked Shanghai in August 1937, leading to the Battle of Shanghai, one of the largest and bloodiest battles of the entire war. For 3 months, Chinese and Japanese forces fought street by street, building by building in intense urban combat. China threw its best German-trained divisions into the battle, determined to show that China would fight. The battle was catastrophic for both sides, but particularly for China. Chinese forces suffered approximately 300,000 casualties, with the best-trained divisions decimated. Japanese casualties were around 70,000. By November, Japanese forces had captured Shanghai, and Chinese forces retreated towards Nanjing, the nationalist capital. What happened next would become one of the defining atrocities of the 20th century. The Nanjing Massacre, 6 weeks of hell. In December 1937, Japanese forces converged on Nanjing. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government had already fled westward to Wuhan and eventually to Chongqing in China's mountainous interior. Nanjing was defended by approximately 90,000 Chinese troops under General Tang Shangji, but they were exhausted from the Shanghai campaign and poorly prepared for a siege. Japanese forces captured Nanjing on December 13, 1937. Then, for approximately 6 weeks, Japanese soldiers committed atrocities on a scale that shocked even the few Western observers who remained in the city. The numbers are disputed and controversial. Chinese estimates claim 300,000 dead, while some Japanese accounts give much lower figures. But reputable historical research suggests that between 40,000 and over 200,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war were killed during the Nanjing Massacre. The exact number may never be known, but the scale was enormous. The killings were not just battlefield deaths. They were systematic executions, murders, and atrocities. Japanese soldiers conducted mass executions of prisoners of war, killed civilians indiscriminately, and engaged in widespread rape. Estimates suggest between 20,000 and 80,000 women were raped, many of whom were then killed. There were killing contests where Japanese officers competed to see who could kill more people with swords. Bodies were dumped in the Yangtze River or buried in mass graves. Why did this happen? Multiple factors: racist attitudes towards Chinese civilians, poor discipline among Japanese troops, anger at Chinese resistance, a military culture that devalued enemy lives, and a breakdown of command control. Some Japanese officers explicitly authorized or encouraged atrocities. The massacre was documented by Western missionaries and businessmen who had stayed in Nanjing and established an international safety zone trying to protect civilians, including John Rabe, a German businessman and Nazi party member who tried to save thousands of Chinese lives and kept detailed diaries. The Nanjing massacre became a defining event in Chinese collective memory. It symbolizes Japanese wartime brutality and is a central element in Chinese narratives about the war. Even today, the massacre remains a deeply emotional issue in China-Japan relations. The controversy is intensified by the fact that some Japanese nationalists deny or minimize the atrocity, which causes outrage in China.
The war expanded. China's strategy of strategic depth. After Nanjing, the war continued. Japanese forces captured city after city, seizing China's richest and most developed coastal regions. By 1938, Japan controlled most of eastern China, including major cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Nanjing, Guangzhou, and Wuhan. But China didn't surrender. Instead, the nationalist government retreated deep into China's interior, establishing a wartime capital in Chongqing, in Sichuan province. The strategy was to trade space for time, use China's vast territory and large population to absorb Japanese attacks, wear down the Japanese military, and wait for international support. China also relocated entire industries westward. Factories were disassembled, loaded onto boats and trucks, and reassembled in the interior. Universities moved inland. Millions of refugees fled westward ahead of Japanese advances. It was a massive undertaking, preserving China's capacity to resist despite losing its most developed regions. The nationalist strategy was based on several calculations. First, Japan couldn't possibly control all of China. The country was too large, the population too great, and logistical challenges too immense. Second, international pressure would eventually constrain Japan. China appealed constantly to the League of Nations and individual powers. Third, Japan would eventually overextend itself or provoke a conflict with Western powers, bringing China powerful allies. These calculations would prove correct, but the cost would be catastrophic. The nature of the war: occupation and resistance. The Second Sino-Japanese War was not like European wars with clear front lines and conventional battles. Instead, it was characterized by brutal Japanese occupation of conquered territories, with harsh repression of any resistance. The Japanese military implemented the Three Alls policy in areas with guerrilla resistance, devastating entire regions. Guerrilla warfare by both communist and nationalist forces behind Japanese lines. The communists particularly excelled at rural guerrilla warfare, building support among peasants and harassing Japanese forces. This guerrilla warfare, while militarily limited, forced Japan to station hundreds of thousands of troops in occupation duty. Strategic bombing and chemical warfare. Japanese forces regularly used chemical weapons, despite international treaties prohibiting them. Estimates suggest chemical weapons were used in at least 2,000 instances during the war. Biological warfare was also used. Unit 731, a secret Japanese military unit, conducted horrific human experimentation and developed biological weapons, killing thousands in experiments and deploying diseases against Chinese civilians and troops. Puppet governments. Japan established collaborationist regimes in occupied areas, including Wang Jingwei's reorganized national government in Nanjing in 1940. Wang Jingwei, a former senior nationalist official, defected and collaborated with Japan, though his government had little real power and was universally condemned in Free China. Mass atrocities throughout the war, not just at Nanjing.
Rape, murder, looting, forced labor, sexual slavery, comfort women's systems, and massacres occurred throughout Japanese-occupied China. The communist factor, growing in the shadows. While the nationalists bore the brunt of fighting major conventional battles against Japanese forces, the communists were engaged in guerrilla warfare and political organizing in the countryside. The communists controlled base areas in northern and central China, where they implemented land reform, mobilized peasants, and built up their forces. The United Front cooperation was always tenuous. Both sides were preparing for the eventual civil war after Japan was defeated. There were even clashes between nationalist and communist forces during the war, most notably the new Fourth Army incident in 1941, where nationalist forces attacked a communist army unit, killing thousands. However, the war years were crucial for the Communist Party. They expanded from perhaps 40,000 members in 1937 to over 1.2 million by 1945. Their military forces grew from poorly equipped guerrilla bands to well-organized armies. They controlled substantial territory in northern China, and critically, they gained legitimacy as patriotic resistors against Japanese invasion, building popular support that would prove decisive in the coming civil war. China's international position, seeking Allied support. Throughout the war, China desperately sought international support. The Western powers were initially hesitant to confront Japan, fearing it would distract from dealing with Hitler's Germany. The United States continued to sell oil and scrap metal to Japan through the late 1930s, resources Japan used to wage war against China. However, China's resistance prevented Japan from achieving quick victory, and this had international implications. As long as China kept fighting, hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops were tied down in China. This became increasingly important as World War II expanded. When Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy in September 1940, joining the Axis powers, China's cause became linked to the broader Allied struggle. The United States began providing limited aid to China, initially through covert channels. After Japan invaded French Indochina in 1940-1941, threatening Western interests in Southeast Asia, the United States imposed increasingly severe economic sanctions on Japan, including an oil embargo in August 1941. These sanctions put Japan in a strategic bind. Without oil, Japan's military machine would grind to a halt. But accepting American demands would mean withdrawing from China and abandoning years of conquest. Japanese leaders decided on a desperate gamble: attack the United States, seize Southeast Asian resources, and hope to achieve a negotiated settlement before American industrial power could overwhelm Japan. Pearl Harbor, China gains an ally. On December 7, 1941, December 8th in Asia, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States into World War II. Simultaneously, Japan launched invasions across Southeast Asia, quickly capturing Hong Kong, the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma. For China, Pearl Harbor was transformative. China was now formally allied with the United States, Britain, and other Allied powers. The Sino-Japanese War had merged into World War II. China would receive American military and economic aid. Most importantly, China was no longer fighting alone. Chiang Kai-shek was named Supreme Commander of the China Theater, and American General Joseph Stilwell was assigned as his Chief of Staff and Commander of American forces in the theater. The relationship between Chiang and Stilwell would be difficult. Stilwell considered Chiang incompetent and corrupt, while Chiang resented American interference and condescension. American aid helped China continue fighting. The famous Hump airlift over the Himalayas, after Japanese conquest of Burma cut land routes, supplied China with weapons, ammunition, and supplies. American aircraft and pilots, including the famous Flying Tigers volunteer group, fought Japanese air forces over China. However, China remained a secondary theater for Allied strategy. Most American resources went to the war against Germany in Europe and the island-hopping campaign against Japan in the Pacific. China's role was primarily to tie down Japanese forces, which it did effectively, with hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops committed to the China theater throughout the war.
The final years, endurance and victory, 1942 to 1945. From 1942 to 1945, the war in China settled into a grinding stalemate. Japan controlled China's coasts and cities, but faced constant guerrilla resistance and couldn't pacify the countryside. Chinese forces, both nationalist and communist, continued resisting, but lacked the strength to launch major offensives to reclaim territory. In 1944, Japan launched Operation Ichi-Go, its last major offensive in China, aimed at capturing American air bases in southern China and opening a land route to Southeast Asia. The operation succeeded in capturing the targeted territory, but it overstretched Japanese forces and couldn't change the war's ultimate trajectory. By 1945, Japan was losing the Pacific War decisively. American forces had captured island after island, moving closer to Japan itself. Strategic bombing was devastating Japanese cities. The Soviet Union was preparing to enter the war against Japan. In August 1945, the end came rapidly. The United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima, August 6th, and Nagasaki, August 9th. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, August 9th, rapidly crushing Japanese forces there. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. The war was over. China had won, but at a catastrophic cost. The cost and legacy. The Second Sino-Japanese War was one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Estimates of Chinese casualties vary widely, but reputable scholarship suggests between 15 and 20 million Chinese deaths, with 3 to 4 million military deaths and 12 to 17 million civilian deaths. Over 95 million people displaced or became refugees. Massive economic destruction. China's modern industrial base was largely destroyed, infrastructure ruined, agricultural production devastated. Cultural losses, countless artifacts, buildings, and heritage sites destroyed. The war's impact on China was profound. It devastated an already poor country, setting back development by decades. It intensified the Chinese Civil War that would resume immediately after Japan's surrender, leading to communist victory in 1949. It created deep national trauma and lasting resentment toward Japan. It made resistance against Japanese aggression a central element of Chinese national identity. For Japan, the war was part of the broader disaster of World War II. Japanese casualties in the China theater alone were over 500,000 dead. The war was criminalized in post-war trials, with Japanese leaders convicted of war crimes. But unlike Germany's confrontation with Nazi atrocities, Japan's reckoning with wartime atrocities has been incomplete and contested, creating ongoing friction with China and other Asian nations. The Second Sino-Japanese War established patterns that continue to affect China-Japan relations. Chinese grievance over Japanese aggression and atrocities, Japanese defensiveness and incomplete acknowledgement of wartime actions, Chinese insistence on remembering history, and Japanese desire to move forward without constantly revisiting the past. When the war ended in August 1945,
The century of conflict wasn't over. It had simply entered a new phase.
The end of World War II in 1945 should have brought peace between China and Japan. Japan was devastated, occupied by American forces, and completely defeated. China had won and was recognized as one of the Big Four allied powers. But the next several decades would see China and Japan on opposite sides of the Cold War divide, separated by ideology, alliance structures, and the unresolved trauma of the war. This period is crucial for understanding modern China-Japan relations, because many current issues have their roots in the Cold War era: the territorial disputes, the history controversies, the lack of a genuine peace treaty, and the role of the United States in their relationship. The occupation of Japan, America reshapes the defeated enemy. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, American forces under General Douglas MacArthur occupied the country and began a comprehensive transformation. Unlike China, which was left to deal with its internal chaos, Japan came under effective American control and was systematically rebuilt, but in America's image and for American strategic purposes. The American occupation lasted until 1952 and fundamentally reshaped Japan. The Americans imposed a new constitution, the 1947 Constitution, that prohibited Japan from maintaining offensive military forces and renounced war as a sovereign right, dismantled Japan's military and industrial conglomerates, implemented land reform, established democratic institutions, and reformed education to remove nationalist and militarist content. Emperor Hirohito, who many believed should have been tried as a war criminal, was allowed to remain as a symbolic figurehead. MacArthur and American policymakers believed that keeping the emperor was essential for maintaining stability and implementing reforms. This decision was controversial. China and other Asian nations that had suffered under Japanese aggression believed Hirohito should have faced justice like German leaders did at Nuremberg. War crimes trials were held. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, Tokyo Trials, held from 1946 to 1948, prosecuted Japanese leaders for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. 7 defendants were executed, including General Tojo Hideki, who had served as prime minister during much of the war. Thousands of others were tried in separate proceedings. However, many Japanese who were responsible for atrocities escaped justice. Unit 731, which conducted biological warfare experiments on Chinese prisoners, saw its personnel granted immunity in exchange for providing research data to the United States. Many officials who served the wartime government returned to positions of power in post-war Japan. This incomplete accountability would become a source of ongoing friction with China. China's Civil War, from World War to Communist victory. While Japan was under American occupation, China descended back into civil war. The uneasy alliance between nationalists and communists collapsed almost immediately after Japan's surrender. Brief attempts at negotiation, mediated by American envoy George Marshall, failed. By 1946, full-scale civil war had resumed. The Chinese Civil War, 1946 to 1949, was fought between Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, who controlled most of China's cities and had American support, and Mao Zedong's communists, who had strong rural bases and effective guerrilla forces. Against expectations, the communists won decisively. Why did the communists win? Multiple factors: better military leadership and strategy, popular support due to land reform and anti-corruption appeals, effective political organization, nationalist corruption and incompetence, and hyperinflation that destroyed the nationalist economic base. American aid to the nationalists, while substantial, couldn't compensate for these fundamental weaknesses. By 1949, the nationalists were collapsing. On October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China in Beijing. Chiang Kai-shek and approximately 2 million nationalists, soldiers, officials, and civilians, fled to Taiwan, where they established the Republic of China government in exile, claiming to still be the legitimate government of all China. This created the two Chinas problem that persists to this day. The PRC government in Beijing controlled mainland China and claimed to be the sole legitimate government of China, including Taiwan. The ROC government in Taipei controlled Taiwan and also claimed to be the sole legitimate government of all China, including the mainland. Each government denied the legitimacy of the other, and both insisted there was only one China. This situation had major implications for Japan-China relations because it meant there were two Chinese governments, both claiming to represent China, and Japan, under American influence, would have to decide which one to recognize. The Cold War divide. Japan and China on opposite sides of the Cold War. The victory of the communists in China coincided with the intensification of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Asia became a major Cold War battlefield, and China and Japan ended up on opposite sides. China, under Mao's leadership, aligned with the Soviet Union. In February 1950, China and the USSR signed the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. China adopted a Soviet-style communist system and positioned itself as a revolutionary power challenging American imperialism and Western capitalism. Japan, occupied and then allied with the United States, became America's key partner in East Asia. The United States stationed substantial military forces in Japan and used Japanese territory as a base for projecting power throughout Asia. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, Japan served as the main logistics base for American operations. The Korean War was particularly significant. When North Korea invaded South Korea in June 1950, the United States intervened, and American forces, under UN command, pushed North Korean forces back to the Chinese border. China, fearing American forces on its border, intervened massively in October 1950, sending hundreds of thousands of volunteers into Korea. Chinese and American forces fought each other directly for nearly 3 years, with enormous casualties on both sides. The Korean War reinforced American determination to keep Japan firmly in the Western camp. In 1951, the San Francisco Peace Treaty officially ended the state of war between Japan and most Allied powers and restored Japanese sovereignty, effective April 1952. The treaty was generous to Japan, requiring no reparations to most nations and allowing Japan to rejoin the international community. However, neither the People's Republic of China nor the Republic of China in Taiwan was invited to sign the San Francisco Peace Treaty. The PRC was excluded because it was seen as an enemy. American and Chinese forces were fighting each other in Korea at the time. And the ROC was excluded due to disputes over which Chinese government should participate. This meant that technically no peace treaty was signed between Japan and China, an ambiguity that would cause problems for decades. Instead, in 1952, Japan signed a separate bilateral peace treaty with the Republic of China in Taiwan, establishing diplomatic relations with the nationalist government and implicitly rejecting the communist government in Beijing. This decision, made under American pressure, aligned Japan with the American Cold War position of not recognizing the PRC. The hostile decades, 1950s, 1960s. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, relations between the PRC and Japan were essentially non-existent. They had no diplomatic relations, very limited trade, and existed in mutually hostile Cold War blocs. China's view of Japan during this period was shaped by several factors. Japan was seen as an American puppet and imperialist collaborator. The continued presence of American military bases in Japan was viewed as a threat to China. Japan's alliance with Taiwan was seen as interference in China's internal affairs and support for the nationalist enemies. Japanese leaders' visits to Yasukuni Shrine, where war criminals were enshrined alongside war dead, was seen as evidence that Japan hadn't genuinely renounced militarism. Japan's view of China was equally negative. China was a communist enemy aligned with the Soviet Union. China's intervention in Korea and support for communist movements throughout Asia made it a security threat. China's revolutionary rhetoric and opposition to the existing international order made it unpredictable and dangerous. Reports of political campaigns like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution painted China as chaotic and extreme. However, there were some unofficial contacts. Trade missions, cultural exchanges, and people-to-people contacts occurred through informal channels. Some Japanese politicians, particularly in the Japan Socialist Party and among business leaders, advocated for better relations with China, arguing that Japan couldn't ignore its massive neighbor forever. The 1970s, Nixon's opening and Japan's response. Everything changed in the early 1970s due to two major geopolitical shifts: the Sino-Soviet split and American rapprochement with China. The Sino-Soviet split had been developing since the late 1950s. China and the Soviet Union, despite both being communist, had increasingly sharp disputes over ideology, leadership, and strategy. By the 1960s, the split was open and deep. In 1969, Chinese and Soviet forces even fought border clashes along the Ussuri River, bringing the two communist giants to the brink of war. This split created an opportunity for American-Chinese rapprochement. President Richard Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger recognized that improving relations with China could pressure the Soviet Union and give the United States strategic flexibility. From China's perspective, better relations with the United States could balance against the Soviet threat and break China's international isolation. In July 1971, Kissinger secretly visited Beijing and met with Zhou Enlai. In February 1972, President Nixon himself visited China in a historic trip, meeting with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. The Shanghai Communique, issued at the end of the visit, established the framework for Sino-American relations. The United States acknowledged that Chinese on both sides of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is only one China. Careful language that didn't explicitly recognize the PRC's sovereignty over Taiwan, but moved in that direction. This American opening to China put Japan in an awkward position. Japan had followed American leadership in isolating China, but now America was establishing relations with Beijing. Japan couldn't afford to be left behind. Moreover, Japanese business leaders had long been interested in the China market, and normalizing relations would open enormous economic opportunities. In September 1972, just months after Nixon's visit, Japanese Prime Minister Tanaka Kakue visited China and met with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. The result was the joint communique establishing diplomatic relations between the People's Republic of China and Japan. This was a momentous agreement. Japan recognized the PRC as the sole legal government of China, severing official diplomatic ties with Taiwan, though maintaining unofficial economic and cultural relations. China renounced its right to war reparations from Japan, a decision made partly to facilitate normalization and partly because demanding reparations would imply that Japan owed reparations to Taiwan as well, complicating the One China principle. Both countries agreed to establish embassies and develop friendly relations. Japan expressed deep remorse for the suffering it caused China during the war, though the language was carefully calibrated and would remain controversial. The Treaty of Peace and Friendship, 1978. Normalizing relations was just the first step. Negotiating a comprehensive peace treaty took another 4 years. The main obstacle was the anti-hegemony clause. China wanted the treaty to include language opposing hegemony by any country in Asia, which was clearly aimed at the Soviet Union. Japan was reluctant to include language that would offend the USSR, with whom Japan had its own territorial disputes. Finally, in August 1978, the Treaty of Peace and Friendship between Japan and China was signed. The treaty included a compromise anti-hegemony clause that satisfied China while being vague enough not to overtly target the USSR. The treaty committed both nations to peaceful resolution of disputes, economic cooperation, and friendly relations. The timing was significant. In December 1978, just months after the treaty was signed, Deng Xiaoping came to full power in China and launched the reform and opening policy that would transform China economically. Japan would play a crucial role in this transformation. The Golden Era, late 1970s and 1980s. The period from the late 1970s through the 1980s is sometimes called the Golden Era of modern China-Japan relations. With diplomatic relations established and China embarking on economic reform, Japan became China's largest source of foreign investment, technology transfer, and development assistance. Japan provided enormous official development assistance to China, yen loans for infrastructure projects, technical assistance, and grant aid. Between 1979 and the early 2000s, Japan provided over $30 billion in ODA to China, helping build roads, railways, airports, ports, and industrial facilities. This aid was crucial to China's early development. Japanese companies invested heavily in China, attracted by low labor costs and market potential. Japanese technology and management practices were transferred to Chinese enterprises. Trade between the two countries grew exponentially. By the mid-1980s, Japan was China's largest trading partner. There was also significant cultural exchange. Japanese anime, products, and pop culture became popular in China. Chinese students went to Japan in large numbers. Tourism increased in both directions. For many Chinese, especially the post-war generation, Japan represented modernity, technology, and economic success, a model to learn from. However, even during this golden era, problems simmered beneath the surface. The history issue never went away. Chinese people hadn't forgotten Japanese wartime atrocities, and periodic incidents such as controversies over Japanese history textbooks that minimized wartime aggression would cause anger in China. The territorial dispute over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea was shelved but not resolved, with both countries agreeing to disagree and focus on other aspects of the relationship. The status of Taiwan remained sensitive, with China insisting on the One China principle and Japan maintaining unofficial relations with Taiwan. Japanese public opinion about China was mixed. While there was support for economic engagement, there was also lingering mistrust and, for older generations, memories of the war. As the 1980s ended and China approached a political crisis, these underlying tensions would resurface. The Golden Era was about to end, and the relationship would enter a new, much more difficult phase.
We've now entered the modern era of China-Japan relations, and this is where things get particularly relevant to understanding the tensions we see today. The period from 1989 to 2012 saw the relationship transform from the relative cooperation of the 1980s into increasingly tense competition marked by nationalist sentiment, historical controversies, and territorial disputes. The end of the Cold War didn't bring the two nations closer together. Instead, it unleashed forces that would drive them apart. Tiananmen and its aftermath. Japan's dilemma. The first major shock came in June 1989 with the Tiananmen Square massacre. Pro-democracy protests that had been growing throughout the spring in Beijing and other Chinese cities were violently suppressed by the Chinese military on June 3rd, 4th, 1989. Hundreds, possibly thousands, of protesters and civilians were killed. The world watched in horror as tanks rolled through Beijing and soldiers fired on unarmed citizens. The international response was swift. Western nations, led by the United States, imposed sanctions on China, including arms embargoes, suspension of high-level contacts, and restrictions on loans and technology transfers. China was internationally isolated and condemned. The promising reform era seemed to be ending in tragedy. Japan faced a difficult choice. The Japanese government condemned the violence and initially joined international sanctions. But Japanese leaders also believed that completely isolating China would be counterproductive and that maintaining engagement was important for regional stability. Unlike Western nations, Japan had complex economic ties with China and geographic proximity that made total isolation impractical. By 1991-1992, Japan began softening its position. Emperor Akihito visited China in 1992, the first visit by a Japanese emperor to China, which was seen as a significant gesture of reconciliation and implicitly signaled Japan's decision to continue engagement despite Tiananmen. Japan also resumed yen loans to China, becoming one of the first major powers to restore normal economic relations. This decision was controversial. Human rights advocates criticized Japan for prioritizing economics over principles, but Japanese policymakers argued that engagement would encourage reform better than isolation would. The decision reflected Japan's calculation that maintaining stable relations with China was a strategic necessity. The 1990s. New sources of friction. The 1990s saw several new issues emerge that would strain China-Japan relations. The history problem intensified. The history problem, disputes over how Japan addresses its wartime aggression and atrocities, became increasingly contentious during the 1990s. Several factors contributed. In the early 1990s, former comfort women forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military during World War II, began publicly testifying about their experiences. Korean and Chinese women, along with women from other occupied countries, came forward with harrowing accounts of abuse. This put pressure on the Japanese government to acknowledge and apologize for the comfort woman system. Japan's response was mixed. In 1993, Chief Cabinet Secretary Kono Yohei issued a statement acknowledging the military's involvement in the comfort woman system and expressing sincere apologies and remorse. This Kono statement was significant, but subsequent Japanese governments sometimes seemed to backtrack, with politicians questioning the extent of military involvement or whether the women were truly forced. Japanese history textbooks became another flashpoint. In the early 1980s, and again in the 1990s and 2000s, controversies erupted when Japanese textbook publishers produced history books that Chinese and Korean critics said whitewashed Japanese wartime atrocities. These textbooks would minimize or omit discussion of events like the Nanjing Massacre, use euphemistic language like advance instead of invasion for Japanese military actions, and downplay the suffering caused by Japanese occupation. While these controversial textbooks were actually adopted by only a small percentage of Japanese schools, their mere existence outraged Chinese public opinion. The Chinese government would protest strongly whenever such textbooks were approved by Japan's Ministry of Education. These textbook controversies occurred in 1982, 1986, 1997, 2001, and 2005, each time damaging China-Japan relations. Yasukuni shrine visits by Japanese prime ministers became increasingly controversial. Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo honors Japan's war dead, but it also includes among those honored 14 Class A war criminals from World War II. When Japanese prime ministers visit Yasukuni, China and Korea view it as honoring war criminals and showing that Japan hasn't genuinely repented for its wartime aggression. Prime Minister Nakasone Yasuhiro visited Yasukuni in 1985, causing strong protests from China. After that, prime ministers generally avoided official visits for years.
But in 1996, Prime Minister Hashimoto Ryutaro visited Yasukuni, reigniting the controversy. Later, Prime Minister Koizumi Junichiro would visit Yasukuni annually from 2001 to 2006, causing serious deterioration in relations with China. From China's perspective, these issues show that Japan hadn't genuinely confronted its wartime history, hadn't sincerely apologized, and that militarist sentiments persisted in Japanese society. From Japan's perspective, Japan had apologized numerous times, provided development assistance to China instead of being required to pay reparations, and China was using history issues for political purposes to constrain Japan and stir up anti-Japanese nationalism. The rise of Chinese nationalism. The 1990s saw a significant rise in Chinese nationalism, partly as a response to the legitimacy crisis the Communist Party faced after Tiananmen. With communist ideology discredited and economic reforms creating social changes, the party needed a new source of legitimacy. Nationalism, and particularly narratives about China's past victimization and current rise, became central to the party's appeal. Patriotic education campaigns in the 1990s emphasized China's century of humiliation from the 1840s to 1949, when China suffered from foreign aggression and internal weakness. Japanese aggression, particularly the Second Sino-Japanese War, was positioned as the most painful chapter of this humiliation. Museums, memorials, films, and textbooks all emphasize Japanese wartime atrocities and Chinese heroic resistance. This education created a generation of Chinese citizens who had strong emotional responses to issues involving Japan. When controversies arose, textbook issues, shrine visits, territorial disputes, public anger in China could be intense. The Chinese government sometimes encouraged this nationalism when it served their purposes, but also occasionally had to moderate it when it threatened to damage relations too severely or get out of control.
Economic competition and changing power dynamics. In the 1990s, the economic relationship between China and Japan began to shift. For decades, Japan had been far wealthier and more economically advanced. Japanese aid, investment, and technology had flowed to China, with Japan clearly the senior partner. But China's economy was growing rapidly, consistently achieving GDP growth rates of 8 to 10% or higher annually. Meanwhile, Japan entered a prolonged economic stagnation after its asset bubble burst in 1991, experiencing the lost decade, which actually lasted much longer than a decade, of minimal growth. By the early 2000s, China was emerging as an economic powerhouse. In 2010, China surpassed Japan to become the world's second-largest economy, a psychologically significant moment. The economic relationship was becoming more balanced, and in some sectors, China was becoming more competitive. This shift created anxiety in Japan. For decades, Japan had been Asia's economic leader. Now, China was rising and might eventually surpass Japan in comprehensive national power. This zero-sum thinking, that China's rise meant Japan's relative decline, increased strategic tensions. Territorial disputes, the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands. The territorial dispute over a group of small, uninhabited islands in the East China Sea escalated during this period. Japan calls them the Senkaku Islands. China calls them the Diaoyu Islands. These tiny islands had been administered by Japan since the 1890s, but China claimed them as inherently Chinese territory illegally seized by Japan. The islands themselves are insignificant, just rocky outcrops with no permanent population, but they matter for several reasons. They're surrounded by rich fishing grounds, there may be undersea oil and gas deposits nearby, and most importantly, they're symbolic of national sovereignty and historical grievances. During the 1972 normalization of relations, both China and Japan agreed to shelve the dispute and not let it interfere with broader relations.
Deng Xiaoping explicitly said the issue could be left to future generations to resolve. This worked for a while, but by the 1990s, the issue was heating up. In 1996, a right-wing Japanese group built a lighthouse on one of the islands, prompting protests from China and Hong Kong. Chinese activists attempted to sail to the islands to assert Chinese sovereignty. In 2004, Chinese activists actually landed on the islands and were arrested by Japanese authorities, causing a crisis. In 2010, a collision between a Chinese fishing boat and Japanese Coast Guard vessels near the islands led to a major diplomatic incident when Japan arrested the Chinese captain. Each incident would trigger nationalist protests in both countries. In China, anti-Japanese protests would sometimes turn violent, with demonstrators attacking Japanese businesses, restaurants, and cars. In Japan, there would be counter-protests and rising anti-Chinese sentiment. The islands' dispute was about more than the islands themselves. It represented competing nationalist narratives, unresolved historical issues, and anxiety about power shifts in the region.
The Taiwan factor. Taiwan remained a sensitive issue throughout this period. China's position was consistent. Taiwan is an inalienable part of China. Reunification is inevitable, and any support for Taiwan independence is intolerable interference in Chinese internal affairs. Japan's position was officially aligned with China's One China principle, but the reality was more complex. Japan maintained extensive unofficial relations with Taiwan, including significant trade and people-to-people exchanges. Many Japanese felt cultural affinity with Taiwan, which had been a Japanese colony from 1895 to 1945, and retained some positive feelings toward Japan compared to the mainland. Japanese strategic thinkers also recognized that Taiwan's status was crucial to Japan's security. If Taiwan came under hostile control, it could threaten Japanese sea lands. In the 1990s and 2000s, Taiwan underwent democratization and developed a stronger, distinct Taiwanese identity, separate from Chinese identity. The rise of pro-independence sentiment in Taiwan alarmed China and complicated Japan's position. Japanese politicians occasionally made statements that seemed supportive of Taiwan, causing angry reactions from Beijing. In 2005, the United States and Japan issued a joint statement identifying Taiwan Strait stability as a common strategic objective, which China viewed as interference. While Japan didn't explicitly support Taiwan independence, China worried that Japan might cooperate with the United States in defending Taiwan if conflict erupted. The Koizumi years. Relations hit bottom. Prime Minister Koizumi Junichiro, who served from 2001 to 2006, represented a low point in modern China-Japan relations. Koizumi was a nationalist who believed that Japan shouldn't be constrained by China's complaints about history issues. He visited Yasukuni Shrine every year of his tenure, despite knowing it would infuriate China and Korea. Koizumi's visits triggered massive anti-Japanese protests in China. In April 2005, demonstrations occurred in dozens of Chinese cities, with tens of thousands of protesters. Japanese embassy buildings were attacked, Japanese businesses vandalized, and Japanese products boycotted. The Chinese government's response was ambiguous. They criticized the violence, but also seemed to tolerate or even encourage the protests as a message to Japan. During the Koizumi years, high-level summit meetings between Chinese and Japanese leaders essentially stopped. The diplomatic freeze lasted for 5 years, an unprecedented breakdown in relations. Trade and economic ties continued because they benefited both sides, but political relations were terrible. The rift during the Koizumi era demonstrated that the relationship had fundamentally changed. The pragmatic cooperation of the 1980s was gone, replaced by nationalist emotions, mutual distrust, and zero-sum thinking about regional influence. Attempts at improvement, 2006 to 2010. After Koizumi left office in 2006, his successors attempted to repair relations.
Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, in his first term, 2006 to 2007, chose not to confirm whether he would visit Yasukuni, using strategic ambiguity to avoid the issue. In 2006, Abe visited Beijing, and in 2007, Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao visited Japan, the first visit by a Chinese premier in 7 years. In 2008, Chinese President Hu Jintao visited Japan, and both sides issued a joint statement committing to a mutually beneficial relationship based on common strategic interests. There were discussions of joint development of gas fields in disputed waters, increased youth exchanges, and cooperation on regional issues. This warming was genuine but fragile. The underlying issues hadn't been resolved, they'd just been managed. And new issues were emerging, particularly China's increasingly assertive foreign policy as its power grew. China's rise and assertiveness. By the late 2010s, China's dramatic rise was reshaping Asian geopolitics. China had become the world's factory, a major trading partner for nearly every country, and was investing globally. Chinese military was modernizing rapidly, with growing capabilities in naval power, missiles, and space technology. With this increased power came increased assertiveness. China was more willing to push its territorial claims, more resistant to what it saw as external interference, and more demanding of respect and deference. The phrase core interests, issues on which China would not compromise, was increasingly used, and it included not only Taiwan, but also Tibet, Xinjiang, and by extension, the South China Sea and East China Sea. For Japan, China's rise was concerning. Japan had spent decades as Asia's leading power, but now China was challenging that position. Chinese growing military capabilities, particularly naval forces, could threaten Japan's sea lands and regional influence. China's economic weight gave it leverage over smaller Asian nations, potentially drawing them into China's orbit. The stage was set for even more intense competition in the 2010s, when tensions would reach levels not seen since the Cold War.
Protests, naval confrontations, nationalist rhetoric, and strategic rivalry. Two leaders would define this era: Xi Jinping for China and Abe Shinzo for Japan. The Nationalization Crisis, 2012. The most serious crisis in modern China-Japan relations erupted in September 2012 over the Senkaku, Diaoyu Islands. The islands had been privately owned by Japanese citizens, but the Japanese government decided to purchase 3 of the islands from their private owner, bringing them under direct state ownership. Japan's rationale was that nationalization would prevent more provocative actions, such as Tokyo Governor Ishihara Shintaro's plan to purchase the islands and develop them. From Japan's perspective, nationalization was actually a moderate choice that maintained the status quo of quiet Japanese administration. China saw it completely differently. From Beijing's perspective, nationalization was a major escalation, a change in legal status that made Japan's illegal occupation more permanent and official. The Chinese response was intense and coordinated. Massive anti-Japanese protests erupted across China, the largest since 2005. Tens of thousands took to the streets in major cities. Japanese businesses, cars, and restaurants were attacked. Some protests turned violent, with looting and destruction of property. A Panasonic factory was burned. Japanese citizens in China were harassed and sometimes attacked. The Chinese government sent official vessels into the waters around the disputed islands for the first time on a regular basis. Chinese Coast Guard and maritime surveillance ships began patrolling the area constantly, effectively challenging Japan's exclusive administrative control. Chinese military aircraft
increased flights near the islands, and there were numerous incidents of Chinese and Japanese aircraft and ships confronting each other in close proximity. This crisis marked a turning point. Before 2012, the island dispute existed, but was managed quietly. After 2012, it became a constant source of friction, with regular confrontations and the real risk of accidental conflict. The crisis demonstrated that nationalist emotions in both countries were powerful, and that the governments felt compelled to take strong stances to satisfy domestic opinion. Xi Jinping's China: more powerful, more assertive. In November 2012, Xi Jinping became General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, and in March 2013, he became President of China. Xi represented a new type of Chinese leader, more assertive, more confident, and more willing to challenge the existing regional order. Xi's vision, articulated in concepts like the Chinese dream and the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, emphasized that China's century of humiliation was over and that China would reclaim its rightful place as a great power. Under Xi, China would not shy away from defending its interests or confronting those who challenged them. Xi's policies that affected Japan included military modernization and expansion. China dramatically increased military spending, built new aircraft carriers, expanded its navy, developed advanced missiles, including carrier-tiller, anti-ship ballistic missiles, and asserted control over disputed territories. The People's Liberation Army Navy became increasingly capable of operating far from China's coast, challenging American and Japanese naval dominance in the Western Pacific. The Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ. In November 2013, China declared an ADIZ over the East China Sea, including the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. An ADIZ requires aircraft entering the zone to identify themselves and follow certain procedures. Japan and the United States immediately rejected China's ADIZ, with the U.S. flying B-52 bombers through the zone without complying with Chinese requirements. This was a clear assertion of Chinese claims and a challenge to Japanese and American freedom of operation. Historical narratives and victimhood nationalism. Under Xi, China elevated commemorations of the Second Sino-Japanese War to new levels. In 2014, China established two new national memorial days, September 3rd as Victory Day, marking the end of World War II, and December 13th as a national memorial day for the victims of the Nanjing massacre. These high-profile commemorations, with major ceremonies attended by top leaders, kept the history issue prominent in Chinese consciousness and in China-Japan relations. Economic leverage. China was now economically powerful enough to use economic tools as leverage. Chinese consumers could boycott Japanese products. Chinese tourists could avoid Japan or be encouraged to visit Japan when relations needed warming. And Chinese companies could target or avoid Japanese partners depending on the political situation. The Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, Xi's massive infrastructure investment program, aimed to build economic and political connections from Asia to Europe and Africa. While not explicitly anti-Japanese, the BRI represented Chinese leadership in regional development, a role Japan had previously played through its ODA programs. Abe Shinzo's Japan, responding to the China challenge. Japan's response to rising Chinese power was embodied by Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, who returned to office in December 2012. He had previously served briefly in 2006-2007,
and would become Japan's longest-serving prime minister, remaining in office until September 2020. Abe was a conservative nationalist who believed Japan needed to stand up to Chinese pressure and reclaim its status as a major power. His policies included constitutional reinterpretation. In 2014, Abe's government reinterpreted Article 9 of Japan's pacifist constitution to allow collective self-defense, meaning Japan could come to the aid of allies under attack, even if Japan itself wasn't directly attacked. This was a significant shift that expanded Japan's military options, though it was controversial domestically and criticized by China as a step towards remilitarization.
Increased defense spending. Abe increased Japan's defense budget after years of minimal growth, strengthening capabilities particularly relevant to scenarios involving China: submarine warfare, missile defense, amphibious operations, and cyber defense. Strengthening alliances. Abe deepened Japan's alliance with the United States, working closely with the Obama and Trump administrations to coordinate responses to Chinese assertiveness. He also built security partnerships with other regional powers concerned about China, including Australia, India, with whom Japan formed a special strategic partnership, and Southeast Asian nations. The free and open Indo-Pacific concept. Abe articulated a vision of the Indo-Pacific region based on rules, freedom of navigation, and resistance to coercion, implicitly a countervision to Chinese regional leadership. This concept was adopted by the United States and became a framework for coordinated responses to Chinese expansion. Economic initiatives. Abe promoted the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, a major trade agreement that included many Pacific nations but excluded China, as a way to shape regional economic rules. Although the United States withdrew from TPP under President Trump, Japan kept the agreement alive as the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP. The Yasukuni visit. In December 2013, Abe visited Yasukuni Shrine, his first visit as Prime Minister. The visit was strongly condemned by China and South Korea, and even drew criticism from the United States, which said it was disappointed by the action. The visit demonstrated Abe's nationalist credentials, but seriously damaged relations. Recognizing the damage, Abe didn't visit Yasukuni again as Prime Minister, though he sent ritual offerings. The Strategic Triangle: China, Japan, and the United States. A crucial aspect of China-Japan relations in this period is the role of the United States. The U.S.-Japan alliance, established in 1951 and updated over the decades, commits the United States to defend Japan. American military bases in Japan, including major facilities in Okinawa, provide the United States with crucial forward deployment in Asia. As China rose, the strategic triangle became increasingly tense. Chinese analysts argued that Japan was encouraging American confrontation with China and hiding behind American protection while provoking China. Japan saw the alliance as essential for deterring Chinese aggression and maintaining regional stability. Japanese leaders worked to ensure that the United States remained committed to defending Japan, including explicitly stating that the Senkaku Islands fell under the treaty's coverage. The United States balanced complex interests, maintaining credibility with Japan and other allies, managing the rise of China without necessary confrontation, and preserving stability in Asia.
Different American administrations handled this balancing act differently, but the overall trajectory was toward viewing China as a strategic competitor and strengthening ties with Japan and other regional partners. This triangle meant that China-Japan tensions couldn't be separated from US-China tensions. Incidents between China and Japan could potentially drag in the United States, raising the stakes considerably. Near-miss incidents and the risk of war. Throughout the 2010s, there were numerous incidents that could have escalated into actual combat. In January 2013, Chinese warships allegedly directed fire control radar, used for targeting weapons, at a Japanese destroyer and helicopter near the disputed islands. If true, this was an extremely provocative act that could be seen as preparation for attack. China denied using fire control radar, but the incident heightened tensions dramatically. In June 2016, a Chinese warship entered Japanese territorial waters near the Senkaku Islands for the first time, a significant escalation from previous patrols in the contiguous zone. In 2017, Chinese military aircraft flew between Japanese home islands, prompting Japan to scramble fighter jets. These kinds of close encounters between military aircraft and ships occurred regularly, with the constant risk that a miscalculation, accident, or unauthorized action by a local commander could trigger a broader conflict. Both countries established communication mechanisms to manage incidents and reduce the risk of accidental escalation. But the fact that such mechanisms were necessary highlighted how dangerous the situation had become. Periods of attempted improvement. Despite the overall trajectory of worsening relations, there were periodic attempts at improvement. In 2014-2015, there were efforts to improve relations, culminating in a brief meeting between Xi Jinping and Abe Shinzo at the APEC summit in Beijing in November 2014. The meeting was awkward, Xi's body language was cold, and photos showed him looking stern and unwelcoming, but it represented at least minimal high-level communication. In 2017-2018, relations warmed somewhat. Xi and Abe had more substantial meetings at international summits. In October 2018, Abe visited China for a formal summit, the first such visit by a Japanese prime minister in 7 years. There was talk of a new era in relations, with agreements on economic cooperation and discussions of a possible visit of Xi to Japan. In 2019, Japan hosted the G20 summit in Osaka, and Xi attended, meeting with Abe. The meeting was cordial, and both sides expressed interest in improving relations. These warming periods showed that both countries recognized the dangers of excessive confrontation and the benefits of cooperation. Economic ties remained strong. China and Japan are major trading partners, with bilateral trade exceeding $300 billion annually. People-to-people exchanges, particularly Chinese tourism to Japan, were significant and growing before the COVID-19 pandemic.
But these improvements were always fragile, vulnerable to being derailed by new controversies, domestic political pressures, or strategic calculations. The pandemic and recent developments, 2020-2025. The COVID-19 pandemic, which began in late 2019 and dominated 2020-2021, had complex effects on China-Japan relations. Initially, there was some cooperation, with Japan providing medical supplies to China and Japanese citizens expressing support through gestures like donating masks. However, the pandemic also accelerated moves to reduce economic dependence on China, with Japan offering financial incentives for Japanese companies to relocate supply chains away from China.
Prime Minister Abe resigned in September 2020 due to health issues, ending his long tenure. His successor, Suga Yoshihide, continued Abe's policies, but served only 1 year. In October 2021, Kishida Fumio became Prime Minister. Under Kishida, Japan continued to balance economic engagement with strategic competition. In 2022-2023, tensions remained high due to continued confrontations around the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, China's increasingly aggressive behavior in the Taiwan Strait, including large-scale military exercises surrounding Taiwan, Japan's concerns about Chinese military capabilities and intentions, Japan's deepening security partnerships with the United States, Australia, India, the Quad, and other regional partners. In 2023, there was another attempt at improvement. In November 2023, Xi Jinping and Kishida Fumio met on the sidelines of the APEC summit in San Francisco. This was the first formal summit between the two leaders. They agreed to resume high-level political, diplomatic, and security dialogues that had been stalled, to take measures to stabilize bilateral relations, and to promote people-to-people exchanges. There were cautious hopes for a more stable relationship. However, through 2024 and into 2025, several factors continued to complicate relations. The Taiwan issue became more prominent. China's pressure on Taiwan increased, with frequent military exercises and incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. Japan explicitly stated that Taiwan's security is directly connected to Japan's security, alarming China. Japan strengthened defense cooperation with Taiwan-focused U.S. military planning. History issues persisted. Controversies over textbooks, shrine visits, and wartime history continued to flare up periodically. China opened new museums and memorials related to Japanese wartime atrocities, keeping the history issue alive in public consciousness. Economic decoupling concerns began taking hold. Both countries began reassessing economic interdependence through a security lens. Japan participated in technology restrictions on China, particularly semiconductors, aligned with American policy. China reduced dependence on Japanese technology in strategic sectors. Military buildups continued. Japan announced significant increases in defense spending, aiming to reach 2% of GDP by 2027, and explicitly identified China as an unprecedented strategic challenge. China continued military modernization with growing capabilities to project power in Japan's vicinity. The South China Sea factor, while not directly involving Japan, China's aggressive actions in the South China Sea, building artificial islands, militarizing them, and confronting other claimant nations, concerned Japan because it demonstrated Chinese willingness to use force to change territorial status quo and threatened crucial sea lanes for Japanese trade. Through 2024 and into 2025, the relationship remained tense but not openly hostile. There was limited high-level dialogue, with occasional meetings between leaders and ministers at international forums. Economic ties remained significant, though both sides were gradually reducing dependence in strategic sectors. Military confrontations around the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands continued regularly, with both sides maintaining constant presence. Public opinion in both countries remained negative, with majorities in both countries viewing the other unfavorably according to various polls. As we reach the end of 2025, several trends defined the relationship. Strategic competition is the dominant framework. Both China and Japan
view each other primarily as strategic competitors rather than partners. While cooperation exists in specific areas, environmental issues, pandemic response, and economic matters, the overall relationship is characterized by rivalry for regional influence. The U.S. alliance remains central to Japan's strategy. Japan has firmly aligned with the United States in viewing China as the primary strategic challenge in Asia. This means that China-Japan relations are inseparable from U.S.-China relations, and any improvement in one bilateral relationship affects the other. Economic interdependence provides ballast, but is declining. Massive trade and investment flows create incentives for stability and limit how far either side can push tensions. However, both countries are consciously reducing strategic dependencies, meaning this stabilizing factor is gradually weakening. Taiwan is the most dangerous flashpoint. If military conflict erupted in the Taiwan Strait, Japan would almost certainly be involved, given U.S. bases on Japanese territory and Japan's stated position that Taiwan's security affects Japanese security. This scenario is the most likely path to direct China-Japan military conflict. Historical grievances remain unresolved. Despite over 50 years since normalization, the history issue continues to poison the relationship. Each new generation learns narratives in China about Japanese aggression and atrocities, in Japan about moving beyond the past and responding to current Chinese threats that perpetuate mutual suspicion. Nationalism on both sides constrains leaders. Public opinion in both countries is nationalistic regarding the other, making compromise politically difficult. Leaders who appear weak toward the other country face domestic backlash, creating pressure for tough stances, even when leaders might prefer accommodation. As we close out 2025, the China-Japan relationship remains one of the most important and dangerous bilateral relationships in the world. These two major economies and significant military powers, with a long history of conflict and deep cultural connections, exist in a state of tense competition that could either gradually stabilize through effective management or escalate into crisis through miscalculation, accident, or deliberate provocation. The question, as we move forward, is not whether China and Japan will agree on history or abandon their strategic competition. Neither seems likely in the foreseeable future. The question is whether they can manage their rivalry without it exploding into open conflict, and whether there are areas where cooperation can temper competition. The stakes couldn't be higher, not just for these two nations, but for all of Asia and the world.
We've covered over 2,000 years of history, from the earliest cultural exchanges to the tense strategic competition at the end of 2025. The China-Japan relationship is one of the most complex and consequential in world affairs. Two ancient civilizations with intertwined histories, deep cultural connections, massive economies, and significant military capabilities, locked in a rivalry shaped by geography, history, nationalism, and power politics. What can we learn from this long history? First, geography is destiny. China and Japan cannot escape being neighbors. They're separated by only a narrow sea, their economies are deeply connected, and their security environments are interlinked. Unlike some rivalries where distance provides a buffer, China and Japan must find ways to coexist in close proximity.
This geographic reality means that complete disengagement is impossible, even when relations are terrible. Second, history matters profoundly. The wounds from the Second Sino-Japanese War remain unhealed 80 years later. The atrocities committed, the millions who died, and the destruction inflicted created trauma that has been transmitted across generations. Unlike German-French reconciliation after World War II, China and Japan never achieved genuine historical reconciliation. Different narratives about the past continue to inflame tensions in the present. Until both societies can arrive at some shared understanding of their history, which doesn't require complete agreement, but does require mutual acknowledgement of suffering and responsibility, history will continue to poison the relationship. Third, nationalism is a powerful and dangerous force. In both China and Japan, nationalist sentiments regarding the other country are strong and can overwhelm rational strategic calculation. Leaders in both countries face domestic pressure to take hardline positions, making compromise difficult even when it might serve national interests. Nationalist emotions can be manipulated by governments, but also escape government control, as seen in violent anti-Japanese protests in China. Managing nationalism is essential for managing the relationship. Fourth, military competition creates risks of accidental war. The constant confrontations around the Senkaku-Daiyu Islands, the close encounters between aircraft and ships, and the arms buildups all create scenarios where an accident, miscalculation, or unauthorized action could trigger a crisis that escalates beyond anyone's control. The risk of stumbling into war without anyone really wanting it is real and concerning. Fifth, economic interdependence is important, but not decisive. China and Japan have enormous economic ties, hundreds of billions in trade, extensive investment flows, and integrated supply chains. This creates powerful incentives for stability and peace. However, history shows that economic ties don't prevent conflict when political and strategic factors override economic interests. Both world wars involved countries with significant economic relationships. The current trend toward economic decoupling suggests that both China and Japan are willing to sacrifice some economic benefits for perceived strategic advantages. The sixth U.S. factor is crucial. The China-Japan rivalry exists within the broader context of U.S.-China strategic competition. Japan's alliance with the United States provides security guarantees, but also constrains Japan's freedom of action and potentially draws Japan into U.S.-China conflicts. China views the U.S.-Japan alliance as a hostile coalition, but also recognizes that the American security commitment to Japan is a constraint on Chinese freedom of action. Any discussion of China-Japan relations must account for this triangular dynamic. Seventh, leadership matters. Different leaders approach the relationship differently. Some prioritize pragmatic cooperation despite strategic competition, like Deng Xiaoping and many Japanese leaders in the 1980s. Others prioritize national dignity and are willing to sacrifice near-term cooperation for long-term strategic position, like Xi Jinping and Abe Shinzo in recent years. Leadership decisions about how to balance competing interests, how much to emphasize history, and how assertively to pursue national interests significantly shape the relationship's trajectory. The current situation: stable competition or unstable crisis? As of the end of 2025, the China-Japan relationship exists in an uneasy state of managed rivalry. It's not war, but it's not peace either. It's a tense competition with elements of cooperation in some areas and confrontation in others. On the positive side, there are communication channels at multiple levels to manage incidents and prevent escalation. Economic ties remain substantial and create ongoing connections between societies. Both governments recognize the dangers of uncontrolled escalation and have shown willingness to pull back from the brink during crises. There are areas of cooperation, including environmental issues, regional economic development, and global governance matters. People-to-people exchanges, while reduced from their peak, continue, providing some social connections beyond governmental relations.
On the negative side, there is no genuine trust between the governments. Historical grievances remain unresolved and are regularly inflamed. Military confrontations around disputed territories occur regularly. Both countries are building military capabilities aimed at countering the other. Public opinion in both countries is predominantly negative toward the other. The Taiwan issue poses an acute risk of direct conflict. The alliance structures and broader geopolitical competition make de-escalation difficult. Possible futures. Where could this go? Looking forward from the end of 2025, several scenarios are possible. Continued managed competition. This is perhaps the most likely scenario in the near term. China and Japan continue their rivalry, but manage it carefully enough to avoid war. Economic ties decline gradually, but don't disappear. Territorial disputes persist, but don't escalate to military conflict. Leaders on both sides balance domestic nationalist pressures with recognition that war would be catastrophic. This scenario is stable but unsatisfying. Relations remain poor, but catastrophe is avoided. Gradual warming. Less likely but possible, especially if there are leadership changes or if external pressures create incentives for cooperation. This would require progress on historical reconciliation, possibly through genuine Japanese acknowledgement and apology, combined with Chinese acceptance and moving forward. It would require shelving territorial disputes or finding creative solutions. It would require both sides restraining nationalism and emphasizing common interests. This scenario seems unlikely given current trajectories, but isn't impossible over a longer time frame. Crisis and potential conflict. Also possible and worryingly plausible. A crisis over Taiwan, an accident around the Senkaku, Diaoyu Islands that escalates. A leadership decision to use military force to achieve objectives, or an unpredicted event could trigger military conflict. Given both countries' military capabilities and their alliance relationships, such a conflict could be devastating and could draw in the United States and potentially other powers. This scenario is the nightmare that policymakers work to prevent, but the risk is real and may be increasing. The Taiwan War Scenario. The most likely path to China-Japan military conflict is through Taiwan. If China attempts to reunify Taiwan by force and the United States intervenes, as seems likely given American commitments and strategic interests, Japan would almost certainly be involved. U.S. bases in Japan would be used for operations, making Japan a target for Chinese attacks. Japan might actively participate in defending Taiwan, given Japanese statements about Taiwan's security being integral to Japan's security. Such a conflict would be catastrophic for the region and potentially for the world, but it's a scenario that security analysts take seriously. What would peace require? Genuine reconciliation and stable peace between China and Japan would require historical healing. This means Japan comprehensively and unambiguously acknowledging wartime aggression and atrocities,
with this acknowledgement being irreversible and consistent across political administrations. It means China accepting such acknowledgement and genuinely moving forward, not continually weaponizing history for political purposes. Neither side has been willing to take these steps completely. Territorial dispute resolution. The Senkaku Diaoyu issue needs a solution, whether that's joint administration, shelving sovereignty questions while sharing resources, international arbitration, or some creative diplomatic formula. Currently, both sides prefer to maintain their claims rather than compromise. Mutual respect for core interests. China needs to accept Japan's right to a self-defense capability and alliance with the United States without viewing this as inherently hostile. Japan needs to accept China's rise and legitimate interests in Asia without viewing every Chinese action as aggressive expansionism. Both need to move from zero-sum thinking to recognition that the other's security enhances rather than diminishes their own. Changed strategic environment. The US-China strategic competition would need to de-escalate, removing pressure on Japan to choose sides. Regional security architectures that include both China and Japan cooperatively would need to develop. This requires changes far beyond China-Japan bilateral relations. Societal change. Nationalist narratives in both countries would need to evolve to allow positive views of the other country. Education systems would need to teach nuanced history that acknowledges both sides' perspectives. Media would need to reduce inflammatory coverage. This requires generational change and is extremely difficult. None of this seems likely in the near term, which is why the relationship will probably remain tense and competitive for the foreseeable future. Final thoughts. The China-Japan conflict, spanning over 2,000 years from early cultural exchanges to modern strategic competition, is fundamentally a tragedy. These are two great civilizations with shared cultural heritage, mutual historical influence, and complementary economic strengths. In an ideal world, they would be partners, leading Asian development and contributing to global peace and prosperity. Instead, they're rivals, competitors, and potential enemies with significant risk of stumbling into devastating war. The conflicts of the past, particularly the horrors of the 1930s and 1940s, cast long shadows over the present. The power politics of today, national pride, territorial disputes, strategic competition create new sources of conflict. Understanding this history helps us appreciate both why the relationship is so difficult and why it matters so much. The decisions made by leaders in Beijing and Tokyo and in Washington will shape not just their own country's futures, but potentially the entire world order. Whether this ancient rivalry can be managed peacefully or whether it will explode into catastrophic conflict is one of the defining questions of our time. As we've seen throughout this long history, choices matter. Leaders can choose confrontation or cooperation, escalation or de-escalation, vengeance or reconciliation. Societies can choose to nurture grievances or to seek understanding. The history of China-Japan relations shows both the worst of human conflict and occasional glimpses of the cooperation that's possible when wisdom prevails over emotion. The story isn't over. History continues to unfold. And as we've learned from over 2,000 years of this relationship, the future is not predetermined. It will be shaped by the choices that leaders and peoples make in the years ahead.
Thank you for joining me on this journey through the entire history of the China-Japan conflict, from ancient times to the end of 2025. It's been a long, complex, and often dark story, but it's essential for understanding our world today. If you found this video informative, please like, subscribe, and share. And let me know in the comments, do you think China and Japan can achieve genuine reconciliation, or is this rivalry destined to continue? What lessons from history do you think are most relevant today? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and remember that understanding history is the first step towards shaping a better future.